G'day mates, it's Busta here, and I would like to give Stitch Fix a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So when it comes to shopping for clothes, I think most of us are pretty much amateurs. Well, I know I am for sure. So why not let a professional handle it for you? And with Stitch Fix, a stylist will do just that. Stitch Fix is an online personal styling service that delivers your favorite clothing, shoes, and accessories directly to you. They have brands that you know and love, plus exclusive styles that you won't find elsewhere. After completing your style profile, your expert personal stylist will send you a hand-picked box of items based on your style and preferences. With Stitch Fix, everyone can look their best. They have solutions for women, men, and kids all over the US, and now the UK as well. With no subscription required, pick between automatic shipments or only getting new pieces on demand. Shipping, exchanges, and returns are always free, and plus, the $20 styling fee is automatically applied towards anything that you keep from your box. I've actually ordered some items through them previously, and I must say that they really chose well, and I was super happy with what I received. Everything fit really nice, and I ended up keeping everything that I ordered. So, get started today at stitchfix.com/scared and get an extra 25% off when you keep everything in your box. That's stitchfix.com/scared. stitchfix.com/scared. Let me give you guys a little bit of background first. I'm an 18-year-old male, I'm 5'10", and I'm not the biggest guy, and I've been hearing and seeing things since I was 6. This story takes place in the 4th house that I lived in, currently in my 5th, and was where the activity really picked up and actually scared me pretty much half to death. But to the best of my recollection, my first accounts of the paranormal was when I was 6 years old and I heard footsteps in and around me when I would be in the basement, and then something had grabbed a pile of papers of my drawings off my dresser in my room and threw me against the adjacent wall. It didn't help that my aunt had a dark entity in her basement who took the form of a large imposing man as well. I never saw him, but apparently my cousins did. And if we stand to be down there for more than a minute, we would just sprint back up the stairs. This all took place in my 2nd house. Then, in my 3rd house when I was 12 or so, the visual phenomenon started to occur. It was here where I saw doors open and close, shadow figures on 2 occasions, and an apparition, a tall and lanky male in a striped shirt and jeans, in the corner of my eye. But after that, the occurrence just stopped for years. I honestly thought that I wouldn't see anything again, but I have never been so wrong in my life. So it was about 2 years after I moved into my 3rd house, 2017. I was about 17 at the time. So I had an unfinished basement, concrete walls, no drywall, and completely open area. In this basement there were 3 light bulbs. The shape of the basement was almost a deformed kind of O shape, and the lights were placed at the ends of the U and one at the middle. And so, whenever I went to work out in the basement, only the light bulb in the space in front of me, one of the end ones, would start to flicker or flash, sometimes fast, other times not. It would only happen when I stepped into the treadmill and would keep going until I just stepped completely off, even if the treadmill was off. Then I would occasionally see a shadow in that space when I wasn't moving. This shadow would pick its head up from the boxes and then duck back after I'd noticed. And my cats, I have 2, would also look over and sometimes look into a space as if someone was just standing somewhere. However, these lights were the occurrences that led up to what happened next. So, it was a Sunday night in summer at about 1 AM or later, I'd say. I was watching comedy YouTube videos and working on pieces of digital art. Art is the way that I make a little bit of income. Out of habit, and also so I can hear my family if they call me whenever, I had my headphones off of one ear and it was pretty much dead silent. My cats were with me at the time and both were asleep next to me. And it was after a little while that I hear a blood-curdling scream as if murder had just occurred downstairs. Only a few seconds after the scream and taking my headphones off, I heard a woman's voice. Now, to my best recollection, the voice of the woman was corresponding to the scream and said, "Why are you screaming?" So, I'm practically floored and I have to investigate, obviously. I walk out of my bedroom and down the hall to the loft area and the staircase. At first, I tried to rationalize that maybe my sister had had a nightmare and my mum woke up and was checking on her. So I checked her room, which was upstairs, and lo and behold, my little sister was just laying in bed, asleep, having passed out while watching makeup tutorials or something. Officially creeped out, I head to the stairs and lean over the railing. And I'm just met with complete and utter darkness. There were no lights on, no glow from the TV, nothing. At this point, I'm just a mix of confused and concerned, but will myself to just go back down to my room. So I settled back down into my bed and continued on with the commission that I was on. But this time, I kept my headphones off and worked in silence, my senses definitely on high alert now. And it was about 15 minutes or so before the activity continued. Surprisingly loud footsteps started up the carpeted stairs and up into the loft area. And it was then that I'm pretty sure I paled a few shades. A male voice sounded from the left, and I could tell it wasn't my dad, and it definitely wasn't me. So I go into protective mode since, unlike my room, my little sister's room is accessible from the loft. I grabbed the only weapon I had in my room, a switchblade, as I thought that a possible intruder was in the house. I texted one of my exes, we're all still friends, who was still awake in the group chat that we had. I told him what was going on and that if I didn't answer in a certain time frame, saying that it was okay, to quickly call the police. So I searched the house quietly and without trying to make too much noise, and I just couldn't find anything or anyone. I looked on all the levels of the house and looked to see if there was a car outside, if the doors were open, a window cracked, anything. But there were no signs of any intrusion. These events were definitely creepy, but were only the starting point of what was to come. So, as the months passed, there was the usual flickering and shadow in the basement, but I just figured that the light was just a wiring issue and was trying to be logical about it. That was, until it started answering questions. So I was messing around once after I was working out and was like, fine, if someone is there, make the lights flicker twice, or something like that. And, to my surprise, it did it on command. However, I never asked more questions as I didn't want to get involved with whatever that was. But it kept going, and I heard footsteps on several occasions in the hall. A shadow figure came up from behind me, another scream one night, and something touched my hand at one point too. In fact, there was so much activity occurring that I kept a journal on my phone of the time and the dates of these occurrences to see if I was crazy or not. And after about a month, I was pretty ticked off and started bad-mouthing whatever it was when I was in the basement. And instantly regretted it. As soon as the final words escaped my lips, I just felt an immense burning sensation on my hip, under my clothing. I pulled my clothing away and was greeted by a scratch running about 5 inches, starting at my hip and ending just above my mid-thigh. Then, about 2 days later, at about 1:30 again, I was asleep in my room and heard the papers of my desk just start rustling and moving around as if someone was going through my stuff. My first instinct is that it was my kitten, who is extremely mischievous, so I looked over. But again, there was just no one there. I roll over into my stomach and look at my tomcat, who is on the bed with me, and he is looking wide-eyed behind me and starts to puff up like one of those Halloween decorations. And then a low growl comes from his throat. I was about to speak to him when I feel what felt like 2 hands on my shoulder blades and a pressure on my lower back like when someone sits on you. It honestly felt as if one of my friends was sitting on me after we tussled or something. My first thought was, am I experiencing sleep paralysis or something? I've never had sleep paralysis, but my mum definitely has it. And that was when I realized that I was definitely awake and was even able to move. So it couldn't be sleep paralysis. Instinctively, I start trying to thrash around and get whoever is on top of me off. Whatever it was, though, wouldn't let me up off of my stomach, so I was swinging my arms wildly behind me, and this is when my arm struck the area above my back, and I just felt the most intense cold feeling as if I just plunged my arm into an ice bath or something. However, this somehow got whatever it was off of me, and I instantly flipped myself over to sit up and look around, and there's nothing. It was at this time that my cat started to calm down again, but neither of us went back to sleep that night for obvious reasons. It was later that day where I felt the same burning sensation as a few days prior on my other hip, and an almost complete cut was on my leg. Strangely enough, too, it was completely identical in placement and length as the previous one. But this time, whatever did this actually drew blood. And it was at this point that I had had enough, and I took every kind of measure that I could to keep this thing at bay. Luckily, this seemed to stop it, and we actually moved out 2 months later or so. Whatever was there didn't follow me to my new house, and I've been able to live 2 years without these experiences and be at peace. There are times where I wonder what that thing was and wonder what it wanted. Did it only want to hurt? Was it trying to do something else? I don't know, and even with this curiosity, I don't want to find out. Was I going insane? Was it all just in my head? From what I heard, a new family lives there now, and I wonder if they've experienced anything like I did. Also, please feel free to ask me questions if you guys want, because I would like to discuss this with people if they wish to. Thanks for listening. So last year was a really busy year for me, meaning that I had pretty much no time to date or meet any girls. Due to my busy schedule, I decided to make a Tinder account. I've never had any experience with such app or online dating, and I didn't actually plan on meeting up with a random girl to go on a blind date or anything. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about and if it actually worked. So, the app still being something new to me, I matched up with this really pretty girl. She seemed short, light-skinned, and had a really nice smile. Her account wasn't a catfish of any sort or fake profile. It seemed genuine and legit. I know at the time that I don't actually want to hit it off with this girl in this manner, but she was pretty hot, and I said, screw it. So I slid into her DMs with a simple, hey, and a couple of hours went by and we got each other's Snapchat users and phone numbers and whatnot. We exchanged Snapchat photos, and I was confident that there was no way that her Tinder account was a fake. I felt better too, knowing that for some reason. She said that she lived in the city that was about 25 to 30 miles north of mine. I also had nothing planned for the next day, and neither did she, so we decided to meet up at her house the next day to mess around. So the next day came by, and we planned to meet up at around 10:30. The neighbouring city where she was from was about a 30 to 45 minute drive from my place, so around 10 p.m.-ish I'd say, I decided that I should start driving over. As I'm driving over, I get a phone call though from her telling me to instead to come over at a later time, around midnight. To be honest with you, I didn't really mind since I have friends who lived in her city, so I paid them a visit while I waited for her. 11:45 p.m. rolled by and I started to drive to her place. My friends didn't know what I was up to, but they just thought that I popped in to visit them randomly. And so, this girl sends me her address, and at the first address that she had sent me, led me to this upper-class suburban neighborhood. I reached the address, and it was close to what I would describe as pretty much a white mansion. I called her to tell her that I was parked on her driveway, and I asked her to come outside so that I could assure myself that I was at the right place. But then she said, I don't see you. Are you sure you followed the directions? And well, to avoid any more stuff-ups, she just sent me her current location through iMessage. At first, I kind of found it odd, but I followed the directions to the location anyway. Midnight rolled by, and I was on my way to her current location, which was actually kind of far off from the address that she had originally sent me. And as I'm driving, the directions are telling me to drive off the path and onto a dirt road surrounded by cornfields. This obviously spooked me a little because I was now in the middle of nowhere, and I was about 10 minutes away from any civilization. Red flags started to go off in my head, but I ignored them because, well, there was no way that her account could have been set up like that. I mean, I had seen pictures of her on Snapchat, and you can't Photoshop those as far as I'm aware. So, after driving through a really dark road through the cornfields, the directions led me to a broken down old house. It honestly looked completely uninhabitable. There were no cars outside or in the driveway. The only light that I saw on was the porch light, and I called this girl to tell her that I was outside. She replies with, "Okay, I'll be right out." On a side note too, I'm a pretty big dude and I train every day. I'm not intimidated by pretty much anyone, but there are some situations where you're pretty much helpless and have no option but to evade for the fear of your life. So, I'm waiting by my car and then I see this figure come out from the door, and it was dressed like a nun. Black veil, long black dress, voodoo charms, and she's also holding a voodoo doll on her left hand. I was pretty spooked out, but I honestly thought that it was just a prank. I gave it a few seconds for the camera to pop up, but the person just stood there. And it was at this point that I slowly started to realize that this was not a prank, because a few seconds later, I saw another figure in a similar black outfit peeking out of the door and then starting to make a run towards me with a machete. I didn't even bother trying to fight back because I knew that I was probably going to end up gutted or skinned alive by these psychos. I immediately jumped into my car and floored it the hell out of there, and then I heard a gunshot a few seconds later behind me. I'm in my car screaming prayers with tears in my eyes because I was hoping to drive away with my life at this point, and then her number kept calling me as soon as I left. I blocked it, and then another number started to call me, and I blocked that as well. Eventually, I got away and calmed myself down, and I ended up staying over at my friend's house that night. I explained everything that took place, and he wanted to go and check it out together with our group of friends, but I was just too terrified to even go back there. Yes, I did call the police, and they went to check it out, but the place was abandoned by the time that they got there. But they ended up saying that the address has been vacant for years and that they simply made a report out of it, and whoever they were never found. But the whole thing was a sick setup to begin with, and the girl was planning on luring me so that they could do God knows what to me. I deleted my Tinder account after that, and I'm pretty sure it works if you're only looking to get laid, but I somehow had the worst luck the first time that I ever decided to use it. My advice: don't ever meet a stranger somewhere that isn't public, because things can really go downhill quickly. For 6 months last year, I lived in the north of Spain. About a week before I was going to move back to Ireland, my friend and I were at my house having dinner and drinking a little. I was renting an apartment in the city, and my roommate was an older lady, maybe in her 50s. I'm 20. That night, my roommate left to go and have dinner with her friends, and about a minute after she left, someone buzzed our door to be let into the building. I looked at the camera and didn't really recognize the woman. She looked to be in her late 20s to early 30s, so I just assumed it was one of my roommate's friends and she was coming to meet her or something like that. At first, I didn't buzz her in because I didn't recognize her, and she walked away from the door, but then I hit the buzzer as soon as she walked away, and then I, myself, walked away from the camera, meaning that I couldn't see if she actually entered or not, assuming that if she didn't enter, she would just call or text my roommate. But boy, was I wrong. This woman came up to my apartment building on the 6th floor. She came up just 2 minutes after my roommate had left, so I know she didn't take the stairs, and I know that they must have seen each other when my roommate got off the lift and the lady got in. Realizing now that this is weird, I choose not to open the door when she rings it. I look through the peephole, just to confirm that it's nobody I actually knew. At this point, I back away from the door and gesture for my friend to be silent. We creep back to my room, which is at the far side of the apartment, and I begin calling my roommate, who isn't picking up. Meanwhile, the lady is incessantly ringing my door. My roommate is not picking up, and my friend is just telling me to open my door. In her mind, it's a woman, so she must be harmless. I tell her that she's an idiot for underestimating the female sex. Well, women can be criminals too, after all. But she keeps telling me to open the door and I refuse. The door keeps ringing and I keep looking out at the peephole. Then at this point, I understand that if she knew my roommate or was looking for someone specific, she would just call or text them. She didn't take out a phone at all and she just stayed eerily silent too. Didn't call out any names or ask if anyone was home. And this was really weird to me. I finally get through to my roommate though. She says that she wasn't expecting anyone and that she doesn't know anyone that age range. She asks if I'm okay and I say that I'm fine. But it's been at least 20 minutes and I know the lady knows someone is home because the lights are on and my understanding is that's why she's not leaving. I continue watching her through the peephole and see her go into the lift for a minute or so and then come back out again. The lift is really loud and I would have definitely heard it, but it didn't. She just went in and came back out again. In my mind, this means that somebody's probably in the lift waiting for her, and this screams sketchy to me. Eventually, after about 40 minutes or so, she finally leaves. I run to our hall and flick on the outside camera, and the lady left the building with 2 men, and they all had backpacks on. I will be eternally grateful for trusting my instincts that day and not listening to my friend, because sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. So this story begins when I was probably 15 or 16, I'd say. Me and my friends were riding around bored as we live in a small undeveloped city with nothing for younger kids to do except get into trouble basically. So we went to the backwoods part of town and was going to pick up one of our friends. We pulled up and he didn't come outside, but he was in his dad's shed. And as we went into the shed, he was with 3 other guys from school that we weren't really that close to. They were kind of like one of those friends who you just cross social classes with or something. But one of the guys had actually brought a Ouija board with him and they were playing around with it with no luck. Now, I said earlier that my friend lives in the backwoods, and I mean that it's almost 6 miles from town with nothing but dirt roads and woods around. But when they had no luck, my friend suggested that there's this old graveyard in the middle of the woods. If I'm being honest, I really did not want to go, but my ride was going, so we pulled up in 2 different cars and he showed us the way. We got there and it was a graveyard, but it was a particularly small one. So we set it on a headstone, but nothing really happened. And so at this point, we were all pretty convinced that the whole thing was just a crock. But to not make this trip a waste, he pulled out some smokes. I didn't smoke, but I was drinking, and after a while, everyone was pretty buzzed, sitting in the middle of a graveyard. I had maybe 4 beers by now and went to go and piss. It was dark out, so I cut my light on my phone and proceeded to a brushed area. Now, when I got to the corner of the graveyard, it was thick and overgrown, so when I saw something beyond the bushes, I was pretty surprised. I called my friends over, and it was the worst rundown building that was still standing that I'd ever seen. It seemed to be some sort of an old church, maybe early 1900s if I had to guess, and it matched the age of the dates on the tombstones. We all stopped talking and started walking through the bushes to reach the front. It was about maybe 550 to 600 square feet if I had to guess. It wasn't big at all, and there were branches in there for sitting and a table, holes in the floor where all you could see was the overgrown grass, and holes in the ceiling and all that sort of stuff. Now, after we got done checking it out, they all suggested that we try the Ouija board in there. As we got into a group and decided to give it a go, they wanted me to ask the questions, so I did. I asked simple questions like, is anyone here? Who are you? And the craziest thing happened. The thing began to move. And we all thought that each other was playing with everyone else and all asked who was moving it one at a time, with all of us doubting each other. It went to L and then to H and then R and stopped. With all of us confused, we were sure that it was someone in the group leading it to random things. But then Josh, one of the three guys that I said that I wasn't that good of friends with, but knew him, asked out loud, "Are you a woman?" We all waited, and Josh was beside me, and he then got wide-eyed and grabbed my arm and was squeezing as hard as he could. He wouldn't say anything, and I said, "Yo, Josh, what's up, man?" And he just looked off in the distance, and soon after just collapsed and was out cold. Now, I swear to you that I am not making this up. He just literally passed out without any logical reason. And I was looking at him scared, and soon all the light fled from the room as each and every one of them left him in there. I, though, stayed by his side, trying to wake him up. Afraid now, I just tried to tune out my adrenaline, which was telling me to flee as well, but Josh came back too and asked, "What the hell?" I told him immediately, "Let's go," and we ran out the front with my phone, getting smoked out from the surrounding dust in the area. We ran by the graveyard and saw one of our friends, and as we got closer, we noticed that the cars were gone and all of our friends had left us. They left us about 2 miles from our friend's house on a dirt road, and then we stopped, and we both came to the realization that seconds ago, that wasn't our friend who took off in the opposite direction. Nervous now that there was probably somebody else out here with us, we began walking for about a minute, and we saw headlights, and it was our friends, and they asked what happened. Me and Josh got into the vehicle, and we got back to our friend's house. Josh called his dad to pick us up, and me and Josh never did hang out with them again, but instead formed our own friendship without them. And that was the last time that we ever messed around with a Ouija board, that's for sure. So, 6 years later though, a couple of months ago in fact, me and Josh checked out the old place and went by there, and the church was gone, but the graveyard was still there. We walked around and laughed at the fact that this is what made us become best friends, and as we were ready to leave on the way out, we actually found the planchette, and Josh threw it deep into the woods. So to give a little bit of background of where I live, it's one of those pre-built neighborhoods from the late 80s. You know, where a contractor buys land and builds houses all the same style and people buy them brand new. That kind of place. At the time of my first experience, I had been living there for about 3 months, I'd say. I was going to lock my car doors and turn off the old bug light that I had and get ready for bed. My house was at the end of the street, kind of in the middle of a big circle of which the road was a circle, so I had a road all the way around my 1-acre property line. I went to the car, and on the way there I saw a little girl, maybe around 11 or 12 if I had to guess. It was summertime, but it was also 11 at night, so it seemed a little bit off to me, but being new to the neighborhood, I just politely waved and said a quick hello. To my surprise, she didn't wave or acknowledge me, so feeling that she was rude, I muttered under my breath, "Yeah, screw you too." And then she just disappears. I ran inside and locked the door, and I told my wife about it, but she didn't believe me, of course. So, skip maybe a year though, and I had a child who was around 2 at this point, and for his birthday I bought him a swing set. He played with it as best as he could for a 2-year-old, and then just sort of stopped after a while. And one day I was drinking some beer and hanging out with my cousins, and all of a sudden one of them noticed the swing was moving. Now, maybe it was the wind, but I didn't feel any, and it didn't explain why only one was moving. I brushed it off though as just a weird event, but then I remembered the little girl, and some months later I had experiences inside my house. So my son was growing older, and a part of getting older is that you start feeling fear. My son was only 2, but he was pretty smart. He was always terrified of this one window that we had too. It was the window too with the swing set. I thought that maybe he wanted to play on it, and that's why he was crying, but it wasn't that. In fact, after trying to offer it to him again and again, he just refused to go outside and was crying and screaming. I laid him on the couch, and once he was asleep, I moved him to the love seat, and I continued watching television until I just dozed off. When all of a sudden I heard the tramping of feet against the wood floor. I woke up annoyed as I thought it was my son up playing and getting all riled up in the middle of the night. I called to him, "Justin, come here, buddy," and the steps stopped. I called again, and my blood ran cold as I noticed him laying on the love seat right where I left him. Needless to say, I got spooked at this point. Also, I kept seeing orbs and shadows all the time. Maybe I was paranoid and it was just my imagination, but it did seem real. I told my best friend about the situation, and he was excited to see if he could muster up some evidence. He's like one of those top-notch, all-into ghost hunter type guys, and he had some sort of thing that produces white noise, and the idea behind it apparently is that a ghost or something can talk through it. And from some sort of added vocabulary, I thought it was all just bullcrap. Until we had a few responses. So he began by asking simple stuff with no reply. Then, after he ran out of questions, the thing said, "swing." I felt a lump in my throat at that and proceeded to the window where the swing was. But to my relief, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then he asked who you are again, and the box said, "street," which was promptly followed by "girl." And at that point, I'd heard enough and knew that it was her, the girl that I saw. He eventually closed it down and shut it all off, and I walked outside because he wanted to see a glimpse of the girl as we stood by the road in the same spot that I saw the girl. He was using a recorder for an EVP. He was playing back audio, but no luck. When all of a sudden we hear footsteps again, and he said, "Sounds like your boy is up." I reminded him that my son and wife, they were in Florida visiting with their grandmother. He wanted to continue to investigate, but I refused to conjure something up, and I didn't even want to believe it was there in the first place. I searched the internet the next day to see if any tragic events had happened in the house, but only an older gentleman had owned the house, and I had, and I couldn't find anything about the neighborhood either. Still to this day, I will occasionally see the sway of the swing, the footsteps, and the occasional shadow or orb, but I've just accepted her place in my home until I have a reason not to. My son still gets freaked out for no reason, it seems, while his eyes will be fixed on something, and he even asked me about a dog that sleeps under his bed sometimes. We don't own a dog and never have, though. All in all, the whole thing seems quite harmless at this point, though. I've experienced paranormal encounters when I was a kid, quite often too, but it all simmered down once I got older, and I have no plans of moving out yet, but if my son continues to be afraid, I assume I have to try something without banishing or killing this thing, if that's even possible, because I don't feel that this thing is sinister or demonic at all, just perhaps a lost soul who feels comfortable with me and my family for some reason, and I can't help but feel sympathetic towards it. So a little bit of backstory. I was a dancer for 6 years and I've worked in many cities and clubs. At the time of this story, I wasn't a rookie anymore, I was pretty well versed in the industry. At the time this took place, I was like 20 or 21 I'd say. It was also in Texas at one of the upscale clubs. I honestly never imagined something like this would ever happen in this place, but apparently I was dead wrong. So I started a shift at about 6 p.m. I liked to get there early to meet with some of my regulars before the crowd came in. It was like 8:30 or 9, and this really good-looking guy came in with some friends. They were all older, like 40 to 45. I grabbed some of my hustle friends and we went and sat with them. It wasn't hard to convince these guys into a VIP room with bottle service, but this is where things got kind of weird. So the guy I was talking to wanted a separate room for just us. I thought that maybe because his friend seemed rowdy and wanting to party hard, that he wanted to have a more relaxed area. I wasn't complaining though, because that meant that I wouldn't have to share my cut of the room, so stupid me saw dollar signs and just went with it. We got 2 bottles of wine, some mixed drinks and shots, and we got settled. Now, a lot of guys that come into clubs like this really want to let loose, and so they brought some illicit substances as well. And these guys had just about everything. I was definitely a party girl at the time too, so yes, I partook in some of these, but I also wasn't stupid. So, at this time, we were all hanging out in one room together. I took a little hit of whatever it was at the back of my hand and continued drinking. After we were all hyped up and ready to party, my guy pulled me into the other room. This guy was like 6'4", I'd say, obviously worked out a lot, and I must admit was also attractive. I, on the other hand, without my heels, was 5'6" and like 120. So I sat down on his lap and I started talking to him and laying down my moves to get him to empty his wallet, basically. We were having really good conversation, and my bouncers were really good about checking up on the girls in the rooms because they were pretty secluded on the second floor. And after about 20 minutes of talking, something just snapped. And all of a sudden, he literally puts his hands around my neck, lifted me up, and slammed me against the back of the couch. The couch backs were tall and padded, so it wouldn't have been heard on the other side, plus with all the music and whatnot. I was literally frozen in fear. In almost 3 years of dancing, I had never been in this situation. He started calling me names and spit in my face, and his grip around my neck would get tighter and tighter when he would feel me try to take a deep breath like I was going to scream. Luckily, there was also VIP rooms across the large overlook, and a bouncer noticed me kicking and flailing. I faintly remember all of the bouncers running into the room, and they had to pry me out of his hands. When I was finally back sitting on the couch, they had him on the floor and outside the room, and his buddies acted like they didn't even know him. My manager grabbed me and carried me like a baby to the dressing room, asked if I needed any medical, and I said no, that I just really was shaken up. His buddies talking to my manager and basically gave me guilt money for that happening. And apparently he was going through some sort of divorce or something and just snapped on me instead of his ex. If that one bouncer hadn't have seen me when he did, I don't know what would have happened to me that night, and I try not to think about it too much these days. I was up late one night. My anxiety and I were battling all day, and the loneliness of the night just made it stronger. It was about 2 a.m, and I was trying to chill in the kitchen, eating an apple and some sort of crackers or something. When I was done, I turned off the lights in the house, double-checked the house was locked up, then went to my room and laid down with my dog. I tried to relax and watch some YouTube for a while, and about an hour later, it's now roughly 3 a.m, and my dog started freaking out. He jumped off the bed and started whining and scratching at the door. I figured that he must need to go to the bathroom, so I put him on a harness and his leash, and I do this because my dog gets curious and tries to leave the backyard often. The leash is about 15-ish feet long, so he can go to the edge of the yard and do his business where he prefers to. But as soon as I opened the bedroom door, he ran faster than I've ever seen him run before, tearing the leash from my hands. I ran after him and turned my phone's flash on. He ran out of the back door, which was wide open. This was obviously not good considering the fact that I had definitely locked it an hour beforehand. But I raced to grab the leash before he jumped the fence. I grabbed some good length and wrestled him onto the porch. I held the leash as tight as I could while he was barking and lunging forward to the bushes. They started rustling, and I could hear the sound of someone climbing over the chain-link fence. I shined my flashlight in that direction quickly, but saw no one. With my voice shaking, I said loud enough for whoever it was to hear, "Who's there?" No response. Shortly after, though, I saw a long branch stick out and slap repeatedly on the fence. Then, whoever or whatever was holding it dragged it along the fence, making rhythmic pings along the way. I was absolutely frozen at this point. But after a moment of silence came a series of, hitting noises, and whoever it was started to drag the stick up and down the fence faster and faster. And it was right then that I noped the hell out of my backyard and back inside, pulling my now foaming-at-the-mouth dog with me. Locking the back door behind me, I ran to my parents' room and told them what happened. They called the police, and I gave my statement. From what we can tell, the only thing missing is a single 15-pound dumbbell. I can't help but think what would have happened if I didn't let my dog out of my room last night, or if I had even fallen asleep. Needless to say, though, I sure hope that person never comes around again. Only my mum ever believed me about this, and unfortunately she's no longer alive, so I can't ask her for any more details than what I've been told while growing up. My dad also just never wants to talk about what happened. So I used to live in this rented house near an appliance store from birth up until I was about 6 years old. I'm 24 now and out of the military, and that tells you how long it's been. Since it was a small house and I was the younger sibling, and my dad worked nights, I ended up sleeping in my parents' room until we moved out. It should be noted too that one side of my bed was against a wall and the other was facing the doorway. So I remember having this Cookie Monster plush that I was obsessed with and would never go to sleep without it. If my mother ever tucked me in without it, I would throw an absolute tantrum until I had my best friend. But things started to change when I was about to turn 4, though. My mum would wake up and notice that I would be sleeping without the plush and that it would be under my bed. Not thinking much of it, she would just put it back in my bed and let me continue sleeping. This kept going on for a couple of weeks until my mum finally decided to ask me about why Cookie Monster would always be under my bed when she would wake up. I actually remember saying something along the lines of, "He's my friend and he talks to me and likes to walk around at night," or something to that effect. From my perspective, I knew I was talking to Cookie Monster because I could see his eyes. You know how he has those kind of big white eyes that stick out? Well, as a kid, I always thought of them. He would talk to me at night and help me go back to sleep when I was scared. My mum played it off as my overactive child's imagination, but it slowly was about to get much worse. So over the course of the next couple of months, I would have these night terrors. And no, not simple nightmares. I'm talking about full-blown night terrors, so bad to the point that I would stiffen up and do nothing but scream as my mum tried to rock me back to sleep. This went on for almost every single night, in fact. They were so scarring on younger me that to this day I remember what they were about. I would be laying in my bed at night when my Cookie Monster plush would come to life, drag me out of my bed and pull me under to eat me. In fact, I never stopped having these dreams until I was about 14. That's how scarring they were. About a year from moving out of the house, though, and into a better place, my mum would learn the truth behind the whole ordeal. She woke up to some noises one night and heard me out in the living room talking to Cookie Monster. Now, you might be expecting that I'm going to say that she saw me talking to the plush, but you're wrong. You might even expect me to say that I was laying in my bed and only the plush was out in the other room, but again, you're wrong. And reality is much, much scarier than any fictional story. What she saw instead is much worse than any paranormal activity crap that you could ever see in any movie theater. Because, instead of a possessed doll, she saw me standing there, talking to the dark. My mum instinctively turned on the light, and as soon as she did, 2 old guys went running out of the now wide-open front door. The only thing I remember from that night was my mum holding on to me for dear life as my dad and the police rushed into the house. The thing that scares me to this day is not the fact that I was talking to 2 random strangers that night, but what scares me is that I was talking to these people for months without even knowing it. I was talking to people who were constantly breaking into my house every night. They were breaking in for months without kidnapping me or stealing anything from us. What terrifies me the most is that, to this day, I still have no idea what they ever planned to do to me. About a decade ago, I was helping my sister and her husband move into their new apartment. It was in a far-off city, so I couldn't exactly drive home right after we were done, and their place was also pretty cramped. So I decided to spend the weekend at her friend's, who I'll call Mary's, house for my bus back home on Monday. Now, Mary is a widow. I'm also a guy, so keep that in mind.
When I first got to Mary's house, I was immediately hit by just how unwelcoming the place felt. She was really nice, but the house just felt angry, as if I was an intruder. The building was also ice cold, despite it being summer and there being no AC. It was off-putting to say the least, but I just chalked it up to my own nerves. Mary starts to show me around the house, but a feeling of just profound unease begins to steadily creep upon me, starting right in my gut. Something is seriously off about this place, but I don't know what exactly. One room was her husband's study, and it looked completely untouched since I was guessing that it was the time of his death. Files, books, computer and a keyboard, pens and pencils, and even an old coffee mug. All of it was covered in some serious dust too. The room didn't look exactly ominous, but it was certainly bizarre. So she finally leads me to the guest room and I start to get ready to turn in. It's about 11 p.m. I leave the one luggage bag that I bought on the floor, change into my pajamas, lay in bed and I try to get to sleep. A few hours later, at about 1 or 1:30 I think, I wake up to what sounds like footsteps. I don't worry too much, thinking that it's probably Mary on her way to the bathroom or something. But then, something just hits me like a brick. These footsteps are just far too deep and far too loud to belong to Mary. They sound like the footsteps of a really big guy. Now, I'm sweating bullets, but all I can really do is stay still and try to go back to sleep. But for a good while, all I can hear is the steady pacing of a large man just outside the door. And I swear to you that at some moments, it felt like whatever the hell was there was just walking right into the room. Eventually, though, I kind of steady myself and I fall back to sleep, reminding myself that the paranormal isn't real. I wake up again at about 3 or 3:30, and this time it felt like someone or something was pinning the covers from below the bed so that I couldn't move. Obviously, I'm terrified and almost paralyzed in fear. After a few moments of struggling, I manage to get the covers off and then the bed starts to just violently shake. I grab my phone and I just take the hell off. I hustle down the stairs in my PJs and I call a taxi to get to a hotel since I'm way too spooked to stay any longer. Once I get off the phone, I quickly go back into the house to get my stuff from the guest room, and I will never forget what I saw next. As I open the door to my room, to my total and utter horror, I see that my luggage has been carefully placed on my bed, opened, and the contents have been completely strewn about. I practically crapped myself, scrambled to get my stuff into my bag, and I sprint out of the house. My dad told me this story on a long car ride once, and it's been on my mind ever since. So, this happened to my dad's cousin, and my dad and him were around the same age at the time. He was 14, and my dad was probably 13 or 12, I think. But they lived in a really bad area where gang activity was extremely frequent. But that's not what this story is about. Instead, let's get to the Ouija board part. So, I'm just going to call my dad's cousin my uncle, since that's what our family does out of respect. My dad was really close to his cousin too, but he often thought that he was a bit crazy at times. My uncle would play the Ouija board just about every day by himself in his room, and he always asked my dad and others to play with him, but everyone always rejected his terrifying offer. He always said that he played it just for fun, but my dad said that he was basically addicted to it. But one day, my uncle's dad found him in his room with a mouthful of foam and having just inhuman behavior and a really deep voice like what you see in horror movies. His dad was scared to even touch him, but he had to pin him down. His parents rushed him to the hospital, and he kind of came to, and after some observations and nothing coming of it, they took him to a priest, and that was pretty much that. A few days later, my uncle tells my dad and his friends that when he was playing the Ouija board, it said the number 14 when he asked him when he would die. My uncle told them that it might be the amount of time that he has to live. But whether it was a matter of 14 days or 14 years or maybe even the age of 14, no one really believed him. My dad honestly thought that he was just acting stupid. But only days later, my uncle was shot by a gang member and killed. My dad eventually remembered while talking to his friends that the board had in fact told him 14. And he really did die at the age of 14. Coincidence or not, nobody wanted to believe the fact that the Ouija board might have predicted his death. I hope you rest in peace, Uncle, that I never got to meet. No one ever believes me when I tell them this except the few people that are involved. But my dad thinks that we're just too imaginative, even though my mum and I will tell the exact same stories at different times, never having talked to each other. But anyway, here's what I have to contribute. So my story starts when I was roughly 8. My parents bought an old farmhouse that's over 100 years old. We found newspaper clippings in the wall when they renovated it from 1864. I had 2 brothers at the time, and we were all outside playing, and they had a tendency to pick on me. So I decided that I was done putting up with it, and went into the house to tattle, as year-olds do. I yelled several times for my mum, and finally got back, "What is it, dear?" Not seeing her though, I yell, "Where are you?" Again, I hear a voice. "I'm over here, dear." But I don't see her, and I call out again. This repeats about 4 times, and as I get closer and the voice gets louder, I passed by a window and glanced out to see my mum and dad out in the distance working on a tractor. My heart instantly jumped into my throat and I book it outside. My brothers are exactly where they were when I went in, so I know it wasn't one of them messing with me too. Throughout the years, I hear voices and TVs and strange noises constantly throughout the house, but just assume that I'm hearing things move up a bit to me being about 17. Parents left town for a few days, and I had some friends come over one night. The night starts off normal, and we play some video games, and all is well. The 2 of my friends need to use the bathroom at one stage, so one goes downstairs and one stays upstairs since there's 2 bathrooms in the house. The first friend comes back from the bathroom and says, Yeah, really funny guys," to the 3 of us that are in the room. We obviously have no idea what he's talking about. He said, "But banging on the door and making weird sounds while I'm taking a piss? So funny, guys." We are all genuinely confused though, as we honestly haven't moved. He doesn't believe us, but sits down and rejoins the group. And now the second friend comes back from downstairs and has a similar complaint. He says that we were bouncing a ball, shuffling things around, laughing outside the door, and heard us run off when the toilet flushed. Well, we again are confused, especially since there weren't enough of us to mess with both of them at the same time. The conversation kind of drops, but neither of them seem convinced that we did nothing. A couple of years go by though, and for some reason the conversation comes up again. We deny it, but they obviously don't believe it. Eventually, that turns into jokes about ghosts and how we disturbed them when the house was remodeled. I was about 13 when we started remodeling, I think. Jokes continue, and someone said, "Oh, come on now. You can't really believe that ghosts exist, right?" And everyone is like, "Nah, they probably don't." When on the other side of the room is a single-fold closet door, and right as we said that, this door explodes open so violently that the folds slam together and bounce almost back shut. We immediately end that conversation, flip every light in the house on, and no one dared to touch that door. The next day, I wanted to make sure something didn't fall, but as I opened the door, there's nothing to close the door and nothing big enough that could have even fallen to slam the door open. Moving forward, though, to me being about 20 and telling my mum of the weird things that I witnessed, she tells me, "Oh, yeah, I know there's at least a family of 3 that I know of. 2 little boys, one always bouncing a ball or something, and the other giggles a lot, and an old man too, I think." And mind you, I hadn't even got to that part in my story yet. My mum runs an antique business and has for years. I've worked with her on various occasions, often changing between working the shop with her and doing construction with my dad. For a while, she ran her business a few towns over with my best friend's dad, and the business was okay, but didn't make enough to support both of them. And well, a few years back, she sold her ownership to him, and just boxed up some of her things from the shop to bring home with her. My dad, however, surprised her and rented her a building in our hometown so that she could run her own shop. She quickly bought everything there and began unpacking. Now, while unpacking, I found an old Ouija board from an estate sale that she had bought out. I showed her. We joked about the creepiness of it, and she said that when she'd gotten it, her co-worker had jokingly played with it to tease her. Our family isn't super religious, but we ain't about tempting demons or anything, that's for sure. And she thought that he'd thrown it away, but apparently he'd snuck it into her stuff as a final prank. And so, we laughed and she tossed it into the garbage pile. A few months later, I was running the front desk when she bought a box of antiques to price down from the attic. We began going through it, and what happened to be at the bottom of the box? The Ouija board, still in its cardboard case, planchette underneath and everything. I recognized it as the same one, too. The box had the same tears and the dents that I remembered. Mum and I looked at each other, and after much debating, we threw it away again. Well, in about 2017, Mum stopped opening the shop. We weren't making too much while open, and instead started buying out estate sales or helping them run it, then buying what was left over to take to the shop, which was still owned. And it became a bit of a storage house for antiques she hoped to one day sell. This last week, May 20th I believe, she asked me to help buckle down the clear-out damaged junk from the shop. We began going through boxes and boxes of stuff and moving them to a trailer to take to a garage sale location. As I was shuffling a box through to the back area to load it, I heard my mother shout, "No effing way!" I thought at first that maybe she'd been bitten by a spider or found something valuable, so I set the box down and rushed back to her to see what was going on. And what I saw sent a chill down my spine. In the back room where she was, the back wall was lined with shelves and there were clothing racks and boxes of clothes stacked in front of it. After moving the boxes, the shelves were clear in view. Most were cluttered with knickknacks or such, but on the bottom shelf, centered and all alone, there sat a familiar board game-sized cardboard box. We just stared at it, then at each other. Neither of us said a word. We pulled it out, and sure enough, it was the same damn box. The corners were torn, the sides were scratched. It was exactly the same one that I'd seen thrown out twice before. Yet somehow, here it was. We tried to tell my dad, but he isn't superstitious whatsoever. My brother didn't believe us also, and they assume that it's a separate game, and part of me wants to think so too, but I've seen that box too closely too many times now, and I know for a fact that it's the same one. So I was living with a few of my friends a year and a half ago. We're all pretty religious. At least two of us work in religion. We were talking about how we didn't believe in ghosts or demons, at least in the sense that we couldn't see them if they were real. We started talking about how if we saw one, though, that it would change our perspective entirely. And so I said out loud, "If something is here, I wish you would just show us." 2 nights later, I'm sound asleep, and I have the most vivid and brutal nightmare that I've ever had. A long story short, I was in my childhood house, we were getting robbed, and the robber shot my father. Only, it was me. I was the robber. My father and I had a very strange relationship, and the detail of the shooting woke me up in tears. I mean, I was absolutely sobbing. And then I looked at the foot of my bed, and I saw a man sitting on his heels just staring at me. He looked like he was 80 years old, but never hit puberty. That's as best as I can describe it. His face looked kind, but his eyes looked just so wicked that it struck terror into my soul. He also almost looked curious, but morbidly so. He was wearing clothes that looked like he was a newspaper salesman from the 1890s in New York or something. I only saw him for a split second, and then he was gone. But the wild thing of all of this, too, is that I got all of that detail in just a split second, like he wanted me to remember him or something. But here's the crazy part. So, I was pretty spooked, right? I went into our living room and watched YouTube and some Twitch streams for a bit until I convinced myself that I was just half asleep and still spooked. I lay back in bed, and the moment my head hits the pillow, my roommate sits straight up in bed, still asleep, points at the foot of my bed and says, "My name, who is that?" And at this point, I literally lost my damn mind, and I drove home at 3 a.m. and told my parents through tears that I wanted to stay home until summer. I stayed home for a week or so and then went back, and my roommate started having night terrors after that, but we moved soon after. I've never been so scared in all my life, and I've had a few questions about my roommate's night terrors a couple of times, so I'll provide some detail for you guys. So basically, we're both sound asleep and he just wakes up screaming. And I don't mean yelling, I mean absolutely screaming at the top of his lungs. If I had to compare it to something, it sounded like an animal in pain. For those of you who have been hunting before, he sounded like a deer screaming after being shot. I got down on the floor, he just slept on the mattress, and tried to calm him down, but we locked eyes and he started to try to climb over me, still screaming. He looked afraid, absolutely terrified, and after 2 or 3 minutes, he just stopped all of a sudden, started mumbling, and went back to sleep. I was holding his hands, and our fingers were locked like when you wrestle a bit, and I had bruises the next day because of just how hard he'd squeezed. The next morning, I asked if he remembered waking up screaming, and he said no, but I had a crazy dream. You got down from your bed and started attacking me, but you were covered in this black sludge, like a face was melting off, but it was this kind of tar-like glue that smelled like decay. After that, 2 of my other roommates and I got together and prayed in our room, and nothing quite as bad has happened after that. Some other less entertaining stuff happened, like couches being stripped of their cushions and things spilling in the middle of the night. At one time, a bottle of wine just exploded out of nowhere, scared us to death, but all of these could just be related to something else, I suppose. To be clear too, I'm a seminary student and I work in ministry for high school students. Not exactly a youth pastor, but sort of. I don't believe in spiritual healings or pretty much anything like that. I'm much more naturalistic about my beliefs, but these things really did happen. Whether it was a hallucination or general spiritual thing, I have no idea. But I'll tell you one thing, I really don't like to think about it. This happened about 6 months ago. The way my backyard is, it kind of leads to my garage. My backyard is more like a deck, if I'm being honest. So, a few weeks prior to this creepy guy, there were lots of cops in my area. This is a low crime rate town, so nothing big ever really happens here. Maybe one stabbing every 3 years and a shooting every 5 years or something, but the cops were looking for this really creepy guy apparently. So one night, I'm home alone, I was playing some video games in the basement when I heard a loud bang outside near my garage. So I go upstairs to investigate, and I look outside, and my garage light is on. I think it's my girlfriend at first, just getting home from work. So I'm standing there for about 5 minutes waiting for her to come through the garage door, but nothing. So I called my girlfriend and asked her if she was home, and she tells me that she won't be home for at least another hour. I'm in shock because I know that I definitely didn't leave that light on. So I ended up calling the police at this point. They came by and checked the garage, and they told me that someone was definitely in there because everything was just thrown everywhere. The cop that came in said that he would sit outside my house until my girlfriend got home, and my girlfriend gets home and the cop waves goodbye. I thought maybe that it was just some kids or something. My girlfriend goes to bed while I made some food, and I ate and went out for a smoke. I get out and light my smoke and look towards my gate. And there was nothing, but I just thought to myself that my mum was playing tricks on me when I hear a noise at my side gate. I look over and there's some 40s guy just looking at me. I ask him, "Yo, what the hell are you doing?" I think I was in shock, but he then tries to open my gate. I threw my smoke at him, ran into the house and locked the door. I called the cops again, told them what happened. They came by again within 5 minutes, and they told me that no one was around, but believed me that he was here because the gate was wide open. I haven't seen him since, but it definitely scared the crap out of me. So I live in Russia, and my encounter happened around a year ago in February. I was walking by the embankment at about 10 p.m. It was already getting dark and nobody was around. There's a road which has 3 levels, a big street, then it goes down to a smaller one, and finally the embankments that turn into the small path through thick snow. So, imagine, you're walking through an industrial area which barely has streetlights, no people, and on your left there's a little forest, and on the right there's a river. So I was walking on the path when I saw a man, and his whole appearance just alarmed me instantly. He had skis on, but was trying to walk as if he was without them. In the deep snow, it was around his knee level. I saw how much effort it took for him to not fall and keep moving, and there was no way to avoid this person because the only tiny path through the snow goes directly there. And he was staring at me, smiling. I'm not sure if it was in a predatory way, but something about that smile was just weird. I thought, well, if anything happens, I can push him and just run away, and kept moving. But when I was right next to him, this happened. Everything only took about 3 seconds or so, but I was watching his every move with my side vision when, in one moment, he just disappeared. There was nowhere to hide, and the trees are like 100 meters away, and hiding in the snow was not an option because you could be visible anyway, and he was just gone. I slightly turned my head in that direction, though, when I captured something right behind me, and the only way I can describe it is like a stick man. It was absolutely black, around my height, maybe a little taller, at 190 or so, and very thin but with a big head, no neck at all. It was standing in a very threatening position with its arms set apart like an animal preparing to attack, and this figure honestly looked like a picture printed straight on the air. Upon seeing it, I turned my head away and just started running to the second level of the road. When I got there, I looked back and this thing was peeking out from a tree, and when I spotted it, it got behind it, hiding. I honestly thought that this thing was after me and that I was going to die for sure upon seeing it, and when I got to the 3rd level, some cars were driving nearby, so it finally calmed me down a little. I looked back again though, and the stick man was standing in the spot where I was just seconds ago, right in the middle of the road. The whole landscape just looked so unreal that at some point I honestly questioned my sanity. This time though, I kept my eye contact and tried to examine this thing. The stick man was slightly moving back and forth, but its whole body had a very stable dark black figure. And I also need to mention the feeling that I got. I've watched some pretty creepy videos in my time, and some people say that upon seeing similar things that they have this feeling like you shouldn't be seeing this. I got something like that as well, and the survival instincts were blurred, but my mind kept telling me to just run. Also, I felt like finally you found me kind of feeling. Imagine when you play hide and seek and your cousin is really slow at finding anybody, so you sit in your place for like 20 minutes. And at first you feel the pleasure from the game, but later it kind of gets boring, so when the cousin finally finds you, you feel some kind of relief. It was a strange feeling, but all I can say is that it felt like something tried to stop me from walking away because at some point there was a little bit of a desire to approach this thing and to become friends. It was obvious though that this thing was following me, and the thing is that I lived pretty close to that place. I honestly didn't know what to do, to either wander the streets so I would lose it hopefully, or go directly home. but this thing would know where I lived if I did that, so I decided to run safely and immediately without looking back. And yeah, that was the end of it. After a while, I lost sight of it, and I did a few more turns and whatnot, and then I just went home. Oddly enough, though, that night, I had sleep paralysis for one of the first times. I remember laying in bed, listening to the sound of the water from my aquarium when it suddenly stopped. A thought popped into my mind immediately that somebody was trying to get my attention, so I opened my eyes, and right next to my bed, there was the same black figure. And upon seeing it, I thought that this was it. This was the end of my life. I literally saw my entire 17 years flash before my eyes, and this figure just stood 3 feet away from me, and then it turned into a kind of mist or a fog or something, and something started to fill my lungs through my nose and throat, and when that mist was entirely inside my body, I just woke up. Or perhaps I didn't sleep at all. I really don't know what happened. The thing is that I haven't noticed any difference within myself since then, so all I can put it down to is some sort of hallucination or sleep paralysis or something. The whole encounter was just really different from anything I've heard of in my life. It's one of those things where you just haven't experienced it before, so you don't actually know what to think or to feel, and you're filled with just curiosity, for a lack of a better term. I often ask myself, though, if I found myself one day in the middle of nowhere approaching a random person with the skis on, and if I disappeared the next moment, would anybody notice? Did that dream mean anything, or was it even a dream? I barely remember that man's face, so it's kind of pointless to search for lost people, I guess. And obviously, is it inside of me or something? Waiting for something? I just really don't know what to think about all of this. And yeah, English isn't my native language, so please bear with my mistakes. I can assure you, though, that this whole thing is completely true, and I didn't add anything. I've told this to only 3 people that I know of, and nobody believed me, which isn't a surprise to me, I must admit. So yeah, if you've encountered something like that too, I would love to know. This happened when I was 16, visiting my grandma, who lives in a small town in Poland. Just for context too, it was a summer and my family wasn't with me at the time. As you can imagine, living without my parents for a short time, my grandma is really chill though, was pretty much a dream. I could stay out as late as I wanted to without my parents being able to approve it. Now, at 16, as pretty much everyone knows, you feel like you're invincible. You don't really think about how many screwed up people there are in this world, and because of this mindset, I wasn't worried about walking alone at night. The day on which this story takes place was really hot. I remember shopping and hanging out with my friends until about 8 p.m. when it started to rain. Instead of walking home quickly, I decided to visit my aunt's home, hang out with my cousin for a bit, and walk home when the rain stopped. Well, I kind of lost track of time, and I ended up leaving her house at about 10:30 p.m. At this point, the rain had mostly stopped though, and this being my favourite type of weather, I declined my aunt's offer to drive me back, telling her that I was getting a cab. I'm still surprised that she actually believed this, but maybe she just didn't care. Anyway, so I went on my way, called my grandma to tell her that I'd be home in about 30 minutes, but not telling her that I was walking alone. If there was one thing that scared me, it was the huge train tracks though, which you had to cross in order to get to my grandma's house the fastest way. So I decided to take the longer way this day, around and through some sort of nature preserve. I'm really not sure what to call it, but that would be my best guess. I enjoyed my walk through the light rain though. That is, until the long metal bridge came into my view, because just as it's beginning, I saw a strange man just standing there. It was a small quiet town, so it wasn't common for people here to be out this late, but I wasn't completely scared immediately, just kind of being cautious. I only saw his back, but he looked like pretty much every other guy that you'd see pass on the street. He didn't seem to notice me as well, and I didn't really care. I got distracted by looking at the trees to my left, but when I came to the beginning of the bridge, the man was nowhere to be seen. I suddenly stopped dead in my tracks and got a really ominous feeling. But this man couldn't have already been out of my view. It would have been impossible for him to move this fast. He would have had to have run, and I definitely would have heard him running on the metal bridge. At the end of the bridge, though, there was a small path that led under it, which was hidden by thick bushes. I got even more scared, though, by the thought that it was possible that he may be hiding in there, waiting for me. So I slowly started to walk backwards, not taking my eyes off the bushes. I hid behind a tree and decided to wait for a few minutes just to see if he was in fact hiding there, although I doubted it and thought I was being paranoid. But after about 10 minutes of being cautious, my biggest fear came true. Suddenly, the man emerged from the bushes, looking in my direction, and he was holding something big and shiny, and I could just make out in the dark that it was definitely a rather large knife. My mind started racing with 1,000 questions. How did he see me? Why didn't I see the knife before? Where was he hiding it? When he suddenly started to run in my direction. Luckily, he didn't see me though, and he ran straight past me, hiding behind this tree, and I was so relieved. When he was out of sight, I just ran faster than I'd ever run before, not stopping to look behind me, being frightened the whole way back, thinking that he'd somehow find me and do whatever sick thing he had in mind. Luckily, though, I arrived home safely, my grandma waiting for me, already mad. I decided not to tell her what happened, though, partially not to worry her, but also so that she wouldn't tell my parents about our secret curfew. Looking back on it, though, this was one of the stupidest lies that I'd ever told because of what happened a month after this incident. 2 teenage girls about my age were stabbed dozens of times by this bridge. But one body was found about 30 meters from it, the other one was thrown into a nearby river. And to this day, nobody knows who did it. But I'm pretty sure that it was the same man who I encountered. I was too scared to come out and tell anyone about what happened, but I just can't help but feel that those 2 girls would be alive today if it wasn't for my stupidity. For context, I'm British and live in England, and this story took place when I was 15. I'm now 18, but it's bugged me ever since it happened. This is a very short story, but it's definitely lingered with me. So, I was playing video games on a Wednesday night, and there was a knock on the door at about 11 PM, which was out of the ordinary, and in and of itself was a bit odd. My mum was the one who answered it, but since it was so late, I came out to see who it was myself. We have a square-shaped spiral staircase with platforms as you go up on each step, and there's a balcony at the top which I could look over. It was also dark, so it would be hard to see me, especially from outside the front door. So when my mum opened the door, there were 2 men who she described as sounding German, wearing black suits, and they were incredibly pasty white, tall, clean-shaven, and quite bulky. But they didn't say anything like why they were there, what they wanted, or who they were. Just asked if I was home. What got me too, though, was that they didn't just go to my first name, but also to my last name, which was weird because it's not very common. My mum thankfully said no and told them that they had the wrong house. My mum, after she had closed the door, told me that they were still outside looking at our windows, so she told me to stay low and out of sight since she thought that they were eyeing the house to see if I was home or not. After about 20 minutes, they finally left the pavement, but my mum was convinced that they sat in their car, still watching, so I hid a bit longer. It was really intimidating, especially considering I was only 15 and had never done anything malicious in my life at this point. This was 3 years ago, and I've heard nothing since. I've always wondered, though, just who they were and what they wanted, or if it even was a malicious encounter. Nevertheless, though, it truly freaked me out, that's for sure.
To clarify too, I'm really not certain if they were German. That's just what my mum said that their accent reminded her of. But they were pretty quiet, so I barely heard them myself, and I only got a glance of them, in the dark outside the door as well, so it was very obscured. Anyway, it was a creepy encounter, and one that I'll never forget. When I went to view our future home, the energy in it was fine. Zero spook level, but after moving in, I began hearing my husband arrive home from work, only to be met with an empty house. And after a year of that, my husband slowly evolved into just an unhappy and angry person. For 8 years, I viewed it logically, and during that time, multiple occurrences, spanning through those 8 years, caused me just extreme and emotional distress. I see a psychiatrist, forced him to make sure that I wasn't suffering from psychosis. He's a fellow Catholic and encouraged me to have the home blessed. I was embarrassed to do so because, well, I hadn't been to Mass or confession for years. But things ranging from blessed and holy objects disappearing for 3 days and reappearing in obvious places to me seeing a devoid of pigment black figure on all fours with its joint bent backwards had occurred. My husband spent the majority of his time in the third, smaller bedroom, which he turned into his office. After a couple of years of him being in the room, it began to make my hair just stand on end. I know that there's probably a totally rational explanation for my feelings and for all of this, but what I'm about to tell you guys just gives me the total creeps. So, I blessed the home with holy water and tricked him into drinking it one night. I didn't seriously expect any results because a part of me just told me that I was simply insane, so why would anything happen? We were about to head to the dock in a box because I had a severe case of bronchitis that just wouldn't clear up. We get in the car and he began behaving in a really odd way. His line of thought was just totally irrational and frightening, to say the least. At one point, I even demanded that he take me back home because I was terrified of being in the car with him. Typical abuse behavior, I know, but there was another thinly veiled layer of just sinister intent that I could only feel. His eyes just looked different. He wound up assaulting me a month or two later as well, and he's not allowed in the home anymore. And this next bit of information is important. I know it's natural to feel relief after being freed from your abuser, and while living here, I adapted routines designed to minimize the probability of supernatural occurrences. Sleeping with the TV on, refusing to vacuum or do dishes while alone, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, the house feels normal, there's no weird malicious undercurrent of energy anymore. I now sleep with no TV because that was acting up too. But I started noticing animals playing in my yard at one point, and a bird even hopped up next to me and let me pat it one morning while I was having my morning smoke. I'd been trying to get back to work for 4 years. 2 days after he left, I actually got a job as well. My luck has increased tenfold, and it's seriously like his presence was just interfering with me on some sort of deeper level. Also, his family is super religious Baptist, but for some reason, even though he claims to be a Christian, he vehemently refused to be baptized with just no definitive answer. Which is cool, but he'd get this crazed look in his eyes when I'd even mention it. I thought that if there was something going on, that it was the manifestation of my misery. During our marriage, I just had the worst and most insane bout of bad luck that I've ever had in my life. But since he's been gone, I'm benefiting in logical ways, but it feels deeper, if that makes sense. I try not to think about all of this for too long because, well, it bothers me and makes me concerned about my mental health or if there actually is something spiritual coming after me. I don't view my husband as evil. I think it's likely that he has a joy-sucking parasite attached to him or something. Maybe I was the parasite. I don't know, but I sure know that it made him unhappy. This happened about 8 or 9 years ago. For reference, the house that I was living in was 2 stories with all the bedrooms upstairs. My room and the one adjacent to that one are across the walkway where you can see into the living room downstairs.
My room itself was arranged where my bed was perpendicular to the door across the room. I also had a small nightstand between my bed and the wall opposite the door as well. So it all started when I had a nightmare where a grudge-looking girl was in my room and left. I followed after her, but she disappeared. I looked over the walkway balcony to see that she was standing downstairs now. I get creeped out and run straight back into my bed with my covers over my head. I turn away from the door, feeling safe after a few minutes. I begin to move my blanket down, and I am horrifiedly greeted to a large floating eye. Now, it still had the skin that goes over the eyeball, but it was just kind of suspended in the air. It had to have been 2 times the size of a normal eye. I freaked out again and finally wake up. All of this felt so real that the only thing that made me realize that it was a dream was that I had woken up facing the other side of the room. I think I would have opted to sleep in my parents' room for a few days had this not been the case as well. So fast forward a few days, I'm getting settled into bed, taking off my glasses and getting adjusted. I'm facing the wall opposite the door when I start seeing something oddly coloured against my very pink wall. Mind you, I'm actually quite blind, so I couldn't make out what it was at first. I thought it was just some sort of eye booger or mega floater in my eye or something, so I rubbed my eyes to make it go away. I looked around a bit to see if the floater would follow, but it didn't. And for some reason, I couldn't keep my eye from not staring at this blob. Maybe because I was curious and still trying to figure out what it exactly was, it didn't occur to me at this point that it was something that wasn't in my eye. I even rechecked if I was really so blind at that point that I couldn't discern what something that close up was. It was probably a feet or a foot and a half away or something. But that was when it started taking shape. After about 10 seconds or so of evaluating my eyesight, it finally became discernible enough to me that it was the exact same eye that I had seen in my dream. I didn't believe it at first, still thinking it was a floater or something more explainable, but I looked around again, just to be stared down by this eye at the exact same place that I had taken my eyes off of momentarily. But then, it was even more clear. And that was when I freaked out and took refuge underneath my covers, turning my back to it as I lay there in a cold sweat. My hair was on the edge the whole time, and it took a while for me to fall asleep, but eventually I just kind of passed out. Nothing like this has ever happened before or after that, but it still boggles my mind when I think about it. Thankfully, my family moved out of that house that year, so I didn't have the pleasure to meet it again, but boy, was it weird. I've come to the conclusion that I'm just a magnet for creepy encounters, crazies, and potentially dangerous situations, probably because I can be incredibly naive. But regardless, let me share my most recent crazy encounter, which happened just before my much-needed vacation to Arizona. So for starters, I would say that I'm a fairly attractive female. I have blonde hair, blue eyes, about 5'2", 125 pounds, so not super tiny, but definitely not big either. I also can't seem to tell when people are genuinely being nice to me or if they're flirting, as I'm super oblivious, which may be the cause for what transpired. I'm not too sure. I won't disclose exactly where I work, but I will say that I work at a warehouse or a club that you have to have a membership in order to do your shopping there. Specifically, I work in the membership department too, so I deal with the new sign-ups, questions, issues with memberships, credit cards, angry members who demand that they speak with a manager or just want to be a turd at you even though you have no control over policy and all that sort of stuff. As a part of the member service department, we're expected to always be super happy-go-lucky and friendly and helpful. Granted, our entire company is dedicated to making our members happy, but the membership desk is supposed to be the Disneyland of our warehouse. What the member wants, we'll bend over backwards to try and make it happen, which can lead to some entitled jerks when they can't get their way and some incredibly scary encounters.
For reference on just how crazy it can be, I had one coworker get screamed at by a man twice her size because he was removed from the membership, which led to several other managers getting involved. A man who was the epitome of a serial killer and terrified members, a manager who was pushed by an angry member, and another member followed me around the store because she was mad that I only refunded her half her money, like I was told to do by my manager. But that's a story for another time and some other place. And that's just to name a few. But most of the time, I must admit that the members are pretty nice about situations that arise. My department is pretty closely knit as well, and despite us getting fairly competitive with our benchmark numbers, we're always there for each other and have each other's backs, which I think becomes pretty important later on down the road for this story. So one day, as I'm working, I have a gentleman come up with an issue about his membership or credit card. The guy, who I'll refer to as Chris, was probably around 6'2" or 6'3", average build with dark hair, dark eyes and a beard. He didn't seem to give off any creepy vibes and was really polite as he tells me what the problem was. Apparently, as he was trying to fill his bike up with gas, his membership or credit card wasn't being read properly or something. He explains that he comes into town maybe once a week or so, and he really only stops at our store to fill up his tank. He also said that the card had his name on it, but it had his mum's membership number and her membership picture on the back, but that he is on her membership as her household member. I was a little confused by this, but I asked to see his card and driver's license, which he hands over happily, and I type in the membership number to pull it up on our system. I continued to have a pretty decent conversation with him, as well as a joke about how I was always the person to get weird and interesting issues with cards. Chris laughs and, after a moment, points beside me and tells me that he knows one of the other co-workers, Tim, as they used to work together at a fast food restaurant, and if he ever gives you trouble, let me know. I just laugh and kind of brush it off, thinking it's just some sort of inside joke between Tim and Chris, and continue to search through the membership. Turns out, Chris isn't anywhere on the membership, nor does it appear as though he was ever on the membership or on any other memberships either. Pretty weird stuff, so I call over a supervisor and show her the system and explain the situation to her, all the while continue to crack jokes and have friendly banter with Chris while he waits. She says that his best bet would be to call the credit card company we're partnered with and figure out what happened to put his name on the credit card tied to his mum's membership. He says that he can do that, and then asks if there's any way that he can still get gas. The supervisor says sure and tells me to tell the gas station to let the attendant know that Chris was coming down and that he'd need help to get the gas and whatnot. I tell the attendant when he answers the phone that Chris would be coming down with a motorcycle to get gas, briefly tell him too what happened with his membership, and then let the attendant know that he's okay to get gas today, he just needs help getting it. The attendant says okay, and I hang up, and Chris thanks me after telling me that my name was very beautiful and unique. I thank him, tell him to have a good day, and then he leaves. And I figured that was that, right? Wrong. Fast forward a couple of days, and I'm closing the membership desk with Tim, and I'm not entirely sure how we got into the topic, but Chris comes up in our conversation. Tim asks me if I remember Chris, and after a little description I say, "Oh yeah, Chris, the guy with the really weird situation with the credit card and his mum's membership, right?" Tim says yeah, and tells me that something had made me uncomfortable. When he went outside for his break an hour or so after Chris had supposedly left, he ran into Chris hanging out by the front entrance. He says that Chris flagged him down, and after sharing some brief pleasantries, Chris starts acting a little twitchy or nervous and says, "Hey, you remember that girl who was helping me with my credit card? What was her name again? Anyway, she's cute, and is she single? I think she's got a thing for me, and I wanted to ask her out." Tim immediately tells him that no, I am not single, and that I'm just really nice, and that he probably misconstrued my friendly demeanor for something more. Tim then goes on to tell me that after he told Chris that I wasn't single, Chris became just visibly upset, muttered something under his breath, and stormed off. Tim also told me, "Yeah, even if you were single, I still would have told him that you weren't. But he really doesn't seem like that good of a guy. I think he's got some issues or something."
Upon hearing this, my first reaction is to laugh nervously and brush off what Tim had just said as just a weird reaction, but on the inside, I must admit that I was freaking out a bit. I've read too many stories and have watched too many crime shows to not think the worst, and I've had my fair share of insane encounters over the years to always be on edge. But I assure myself that nothing will come out of the situation, and I was just working myself up over nothing really. And it was true, for a few days at least. We cut to Saturday, and one of the busiest days for retail shopping. Membership and refunds are fairly busy, with anywhere between 5 to 15-minute intervals without members to give us downtime to just clean and file paperwork, etc. I'm having a pretty good day, just shooting the breeze with my co-workers and trying to be on top of everything. Since it was a slow period, we were running breaks and our supervisor was doing some office work or something, so it was just me, Addie, Rick, who were filling up the kiosks, and Emmy, who was working on the returns that were trickling in. I was having a conversation with Addie and organising the returns when I hear someone yelling at me from behind. Hey, I'm talking to you! Hey! I vaguely recognize the voice, but it's only when I turn around to look at who's shouting at me that I know who it is. And my heart drops in my stomach. Standing in front of me is Chris, who looks really pissed off and disheveled. He is standing as close to the counter as he can, staring at me with a really menacing look. Hoping maybe that he just needs some help and it's nothing too serious, I plaster on my friendly customer service smile and walk over to the computer closest to where he was standing. I say, hi Chris, what can I do for you? You don't have another weird situation you need me to take a look at, do you? I force out a laugh at this, but he doesn't even crack a smile. Instead, he points a finger at me, and when he speaks, his voice is super low murmur that only added to the creepiness and menacing factor. You lied to me. By now, Maddie seems to sense my discomfort and stands to the computer next to me, pretending to work on something while listening into the conversation. I tell Chris, I'm sorry. What do you mean? Did the bank not figure out the issue or something? He shakes his head and says that isn't the problem. So I ask him what the problem is, and he says, You're the problem. You led me on. I'm sure my confusion is visible, and Addie and I exchange a glance. She suddenly gestures if she should get a manager, and I subtly tell her no before I turn my attention back to him. I ask what he means by that, and he states that I let him on when I knew that he was flirting with me because I was flirting back despite having a boyfriend and that it was a real bitch move. I say, well, I'm really sorry if I seem that way, but I promise you that I wasn't flirting with you. I was just trying to be polite. I didn't realize that you were flirting with me. I'm really sorry. And he starts to become more upset, pulling at his hair, rubbing his face, and then says, No, you did know, and you were just pulling me along. I'm not someone to be messed with like that, and you're going to regret messing with me. At this point, Rick had come back from the kiosk, and Addie was quietly filling him in on the situation away from me and Chris so that they wouldn't be overheard. Rick, who's a Navy veteran and a pretty large guy at about 6'1" and heavyset, is watching Chris closely, and when Chris starts to seem threatening, he puts himself into the conversation. Rick asks Chris if there's a problem, but Chris ignores him and continues to berate me while I just stay quiet, too scared to speak. He calls me all sorts of names and then says that I could have had it all if I'd just given him a chance. He continues to tell me that I wasted that chance the moment that I let him on and that I was going to pay for this. Chris then reaches over the counter and tries to grab my arm or slap me or something. But Rick pushes me to the side away from Chris, and Addie is on the radio calling for a supervisor or a manager to please come to the membership desk now. I remember seeing a front-end supervisor, Shadow, running from the cashier line to where the membership desk was, and I remember panicking thinking that Chris might have a gun and that what if he tried to hurt someone with it. Meanwhile, as I'm worrying about what could happen, Rick is telling Chris that he needs to calm down and not speak to me that way. And Chris then loses it and starts slapping his hand on the table and pointing at me, saying that I'm the problem and that he has every right to speak to me that way because I was being a stupid hoe. And Shadow finally shows up as Chris continues to sprue crude insults at me, and Shadow, after realizing Chris was yelling at me and seeing how upset I was, quietly tells me to take my break before radioing for some help at the membership and asking Chris what the problem was. I start to leave, but Chris starts to follow after me while Rick and Shadow start following Chris to stop him. I feel myself on the verge of a panic attack and start speed walking while Chris continues to shout at me, and then he pushes me. I manage to catch myself on the battery display, and Rick and Shadow catch up on him and attempt to detain him as best as they could. And Addie makes another call for a warehouse manager and to our security guard while passerbys watch the whole situation go down. Shadow tells me to go, and at this time I just run to the break room where I have a complete breakdown, shaking and crying and unable to breathe as other employees on their break ask if I'm okay and try to help out. After maybe 10 minutes, when I had just started to calm down, one of the warehouse managers, Lena, and the security guard come in and ask if I can go with them into the office. I follow, and we go into the GM or AGM's office and shut the door. They tell me to sit down, and after they ask me if I'm okay and ask what happened, to which I told them the entirety of the story, they tell me that, unfortunately, Chris got away. I'm too shocked to ask anything other than how, and they explain that not long after I left and right before they arrived at the membership desk, Chris managed to get out of the hole that he was in and ran to the closed door beside the exit, which he pushed open to avoid the crowd, set off the alarm that Lena had to shut off, and then booked it to the parking lot. They spent the next 5 or so minutes trying to locate him, but he was gone, and there were no cameras outside the warehouse to try and capture his license plate or anything else. And because of his strange membership situation, and because we only had his first name and a description of what he looked like, there was pretty much no way that we could pull him up in the system to notify authorities. Really, the only thing we did have was a grainy video of him being hostile at the desk, following and pushing me, and then assaulting Rick by elbowing them in the face and pushing Shadow back, which wouldn't be difficult since Chris was about a head taller and was larger than the supervisor, to get away. I was livid that he escaped, obviously, but also pretty terrified, and the feeling of fear only escalated when Lena said, "So, we also want you to know that he actually threatened that he'd be back." They offered to have a fellow co-worker walk with me to my car at the end of my shift, which I was more than thankful for, and that they would have a lock security being more vigilant in making sure that no one strange came by our store when we were closed until the situation was either solved or died down. There was nothing more that I could do as well, and the most my work could do was just keep on the lookout for Chris and alert others if he came into the store again. I honestly felt powerless, and I still feel powerless. Always being on edge and on the lookout for Chris is just driving me crazy, and I'm so paranoid that I'll somehow run into him that I just avoid going places now. The walk to and from my car before and after every shift is honestly terrifying because I don't know if Chris is watching. And if I think a vehicle has been following me for too long, I make random turns until I just lose them. I'm scared, guys, that Chris is going to come back to the store or find me when I'm alone and do something awful. The only peace that I found was when I left the state for a week for a trip, but even then I was still a little paranoid that he managed to follow me. I keep my pocket knife close by anywhere I'm at, and I'm planning on getting my concealed weapons permit just to feel safer. And does that make me crazy? I don't know. It's been a little over 2 weeks since this whole situation went down, and I'm just praying that nothing more sinister will come out of it. Oh, and I did talk to my coworker Tim, who actually did know Chris beforehand, and he offered to talk to his old boss to get Chris's information so we could give the police something to go on. From my understanding, the old manager didn't really want to give out Chris's information, but after Tim told him what was going on and that the police are more than likely going to get involved to keep him from hurting me or anyone else, he eventually gave him Chris's last name, a phone number, and an address, which we immediately gave to the police and filed a report. The only problem now is that all of it led to dead ends. It doesn't look like Chris has any social media, the phone number was disconnected, and the address given was abandoned. It's honestly like he just never even existed. Currently, the cops are digging around to see if they can get any more information and find him, but so far, nothing has turned up. They think that maybe he fled the state or is holed up somewhere or something like that. I don't really know what happened to him or where he went to, but I'm hoping that he's not going to come back. A lot of people suggested too getting mace or pepper spray, so I did pick some up, and I still have someone walk me to my car these days. So I've been thinking about spending part of my summer at my grandparents' cottage in the countryside in the north of Spain. They live in a small village where everyone is either a farmer or a shepherd, and nearly everyone is a relative of some degree. It's in a not very densely forested place, surrounded by pastures with patches of pine trees and eucalyptus. Discussing it with my mother, she seemed quite off about it, being worried about me going alone there, even if I've been travelling abroad alone numerous times already. I wanted to hike around the village and its forests and just get some memories from my childhood. And thinking about it, I've realized just how many weird things I've experienced there. As a kid, I used to be on my own a lot. I had very few restrictions. Basically, don't get into the forest and near an old abandoned mill because it supposedly was full of snakes or something. Also, I had to be home before sunset. Quite normal stuff for a kid, yeah, but when those rules were being applied to me as a teen, which I didn't follow, gotta say, my grandma used to freak out when I arrived late or I wandered around. And now I'm getting a bit of a feeling as to why this was the case. Here's a brief summary of the weird stuff that I've experienced there. So first of all, my grandfather used to scare me by saying that there was this huge boar roaming the streets at night and that he would eat me. Boars are an absolute plague here. My grandfather stopped saying anything about that after an incident though, because one night, something started hitting the main door and it was doing it with a lot of strength. I said that it must have been a boar at the time, but my grandfather was just pale and went to grab his shotgun and told my grandmother and me to be quiet. He was really scared, and I gotta say, my grandpa's the guy with the biggest balls that I know. Another day, a few years later, I was wandering in a road that goes through the forest. It wasn't really dense, only pines and ferns and brambles, and I saw something that I thought was a deer move and kind of look at me. But I can't remember the deer, just a pitch-black silhouette that, if it was a deer, it was deformed and just really off. I tried to follow it, and it was going deeper into the woods. I got disorientated at some point, and the next thing I remember is that I was lying on the road feeling a weird tickling in my stomach. I saw a similar thing once again, but in a near pasture, and again I remember a silhouette, more black, of what looked like a deformed deer. But I remember it staring at me, and a feeling of just being frozen washed over me. Even now it makes me feel really uncomfortable thinking about it, and after that I can't remember any more. The next thing I knew, I was back at home, and it still leaves me with a really bad feeling in my stomach. But the last weird experience was walking next to the local cemetery. It was on the side of a hill, and it's all pasture next to it, and I remember a stone hitting me, but one too big to be some kind of weird accident with the wind or something. I looked behind, and I didn't see anything, but I started feeling like I just needed to throw up, and I rushed home feeling something was following me. As a final point, too, there are a few places in the village that just have a dreadful feeling when you get too close to them. One is an abandoned mill next to a bridge, and going next to it just always makes me feel really off. And I'm not the only one, too, as both my cousins and a friend reported feeling the same. Another place is a nameless grave or memorial in the limits of the village that sometimes there are animal bones just lying around it. I asked my grandmother about it, but she always just kind of brushed it off and never really gave us a clear answer. My grandfather always says that there's stuff that we should just leave alone and not to meddle with it. Being honest with you guys, I feel like I have to go, and I really have an urge to know more about that place. But I also feel like I should stay away from that place at all costs. My parents avoid going there, and my cousins told me that their parents won't let them go there either because they think the village is not good for them or cursed or something. I'll keep you guys updated if I end up going back and if there's any more stories. And thanks for listening. So this isn't the first paranormal experience that I've had, but it's the first that I just can't explain away with sense. So I work in a mental health facility. It's not a secure unit. It's like a supported living environment where people with mental health issues go after being released from hospital into the community. They're free to come and go as they please, and their issues are just well managed. I worked my first night shift last week with one other staff member. During the night, I was tasked with cleaning the bathrooms. The house itself is a large Victorian building. I had no issue cleaning the place, was very comfortable, until I had to do the bathroom in the attic. Now, I've not been in the attic before, but I went up there with no issue. I don't scare easily. I'm an ex-police officer, in fact. I can handle myself. But the whole time I was up there, I just had this weird feeling in my stomach that I was being watched. I was very uneasy, and this is not like me at all. I looked around, and there was no one there. It was in the middle of the night, and everyone was asleep, so I finished up as quickly as I could and went back downstairs, where I felt better instantly. Again, though, I just couldn't explain why I felt that way. Anyway, I come into work tonight for my night shift. This time I'm the only member of the staff working. I'm chatting away to a resident and mention the way I was feeling last shift. And she then reveals that I'm not the first staff member to say that. Some refuse to go up there at all, in fact. Even the resident herself mentions seeing lights on in an empty room up there in the middle of the night with no explanation as to how a light could turn on and off in a locked room. Okay, so I've now decided that I will skip cleaning that bathroom tonight after all. Cut to a few hours later, though. I'm in the common area on the ground floor, and I hear the hallway door open and close several times. The door I'm hearing is a really heavy fire door, and I assume someone is awake and walking around, so I go out and check. But when I get there, there's no one. Okay, so I just must have missed them, right? But then, as I go to turn around, I watch this door open all the way, stay open for several moments, and then just close. Now, there is no breeze in this house whatsoever. I'd already shut all the windows and the external doors, and there's just really no explanation for this. It's a really heavy door, and it takes a lot of force to open it. But I watched this happen twice, right before my eyes. Can anyone offer any insight as to how a door can open and close by itself like that? Or why I would feel just so uneasy upstairs having no prior knowledge that others have had weird experiences up there too? I'm here for another 9 hours, and I'm scaring myself half to death right now just thinking about all of this. Last night at around 10:30 p.m, I got a call from one of my friends. My daughter was asleep next to me in the bedroom, so I decided to go out into the lounge room. All the lights were off, so I turned on our kitchen light and sat on the couch. And after about 10 minutes, I got up a little freaked out because our TV just randomly turned on. It had never done that, so I told my friend that I was going to go and sit in the bathroom and chat with her. I sat on the side of the bathtub, and after a few minutes, I started hearing a weird noise from the yard outside the bathroom windows. I told my friend to be quiet because I could distinctly hear my toddler calling "Mum, Mum" from outside. Our pool light was on, so I was able to see that no one was calling from where the light was shining, but the voice was coming from where the light just couldn't reach. I went in the opposite direction to my daughter's bedroom to confirm that she was indeed still sound asleep in bed. I went back to the bathroom and heard the voice call me again, and then just complete silence. I honestly have no idea what that was, but it was 100% my toddler's voice. I lived in a house from when I was 3 to 10, where things happened that I just cannot explain. Although I was a child, so my memory could be a little bit foggy. So, my mum was working weekend shifts in Norway, since they have better payments and less tax on those days, so she would go like 5 to 7 days at a time. We're Danish, by the way. That night, it was just me and my sister and my dad. My sister would sleepwalk very much as a child, so it was not an uncommon occurrence to find her in all kinds of crazy places. One time, she slept under the couch. Many times, she would just be standing in the corners and weird places. Nothing paranormal about it, just a sleeping child with marathon legs kind of weird, as my mother used to say. So, I was a little turd when I was a kid, and I was very afraid of the dark, but I wouldn't wake up and cry if I had nightmares. I would most likely just scream, but my sister would cry, very silently, whenever she awoke on one of her sleepwalkings. Now, my father is very much a manly man, and my friends used to be scared of him. In fact, they called him the warlord because, well, that's kind of what he looked like. He's conservative in the sense that he doesn't believe in anything that he can't see with his own 2 eyes. My mum is very much a believer and even believes she can speak to spirits and stuff. I personally believe that there's more between the heavens and the earth, but I'm also very much a skeptic, even though I have had some weird experiences. Anyway, normally it was always me, my sister, and our mum that spoke of weird things that had happened, but a few years after we moved, my dad told us his story. So, he awoke one night and he could hear someone crying. Naturally, when hearing this, he went looking for her, as he thought my sister probably sleepwalked somewhere and got scared when she awoke. This happened in periods almost every night, and as he went down from the first floor, he realized that it was coming from the basement. The only way down to this basement was down a really steep staircase, and keep in mind this was in the middle of the night too. Believing, though, that my sister somehow managed to get down there, he of course went looking for her. Again, they have found her in some weird places, so this wouldn't be totally unbelievable to them. But he says that the crying stopped the moment he went down there, and he felt like he was being watched, and that there was this black figure over near the wall close to one of the doors for the rooms. As he tried to get closer, he felt uneasy in his words, and then the door closed where he saw the black figure, like slamming, and he says that he heard a scream unlike any he had heard before. I actually remember being woken up that night and him taking us to a hostel, but never really saying why. I was a child, but I remember this very clearly. But when he tells this story too, he will always end it with, "And that was the only time I ever ran from something in pure terror." Turns out, too, that my sister was actually sleeping in my room that night, but in his sleepy days, my dad forgot. Her sleeping in my room actually became my parents' secret weapon against the sleepwalk, since I would wake every time she started to sleepwalk because I was a very light sleeper, and I would call for my parents. I have no idea what happened that night in that basement, but I've never seen him as scared as that night, and even though it was almost 18 to 20 years ago, he still looks pretty shook up and upset when telling it, like it shook him to this day. I grew up not far from Manteno State Hospital, an abandoned insane asylum in the far south Chicago suburbs. My dad would sometimes drive my family down there, and we'd circle around the property by car just for fun. When I turned 16, he bought me my own little beater car, and of course I had to show this awesome place to my friends. By the time I was old enough to go exploring, many of the original buildings had been renovated and repurposed as businesses. Half of the property was converted in the local VA hospital, and a quarter of it was torn down and placed with new housing and whatnot, which meant that only a handful of the original buildings remained, and they were all clustered in the back corner of the campus. Now, one summer I took my friends, A, B, and C, to go and check it out. Well, we brought our cameras and went with the intent to go inside and explore it. We parked in a lot where other people parked to go to work in one of the other buildings to avoid suspicion, and walked about a quarter-mile to the abandoned hall. As we walked up to this really creepy old building, I felt sick to my stomach and just full of dread. But the main doors were chained shut and most of the windows were boarded up. I remember walking on the porchway and choosing my steps very carefully because the windows were busted out and there was just glass everywhere. Eventually, though, the four of us finally came upon a window that was accessible enough to climb into. Realizing that this was actually going to happen, I had a bit of a panic attack and couldn't go through with it. I was trembling and didn't want to be the scaredy cat, but I really just couldn't do it. In fact, just in recounting this, I'm still pretty scared, and this happened about 16 years ago already, I think. Anyway, I handed my camera to my friend A and told him to take the pictures. I was petrified and felt like I was going to puke at any moment. A friend B and I walked back to the car in silence after this. I had a cigarette in the car while we waited for friends A and C to come back. My nerves calmed quickly enough once I was walking away. Friend B confessed that she was scared too and was glad that I said something so that she didn't have to go in as well. Soon enough, though, our other two friends came running back at the car full speed, and we heard their footsteps pounding on the asphalt and quickly unlocked the doors. I started the car up and we were off in pretty much an instant. I assumed that the cops had arrived, so I sped out of the campus and into town, hoping to blend into the normal traffic. I asked them what had happened and if the cops were called, and they both said no. Both friends had gone into the building and said that they heard voices. Both of them also said that they saw a hand curl around the frame of a big metal corridor door and heard it slam shut with an impressive echo. Both of them testified that they heard someone crying, saying, "Where am I?" And at some point they just got too frightened to continue and just decided to bolt. I was obviously spooked. Friend A, who had taken my camera, was eerily quiet. Friend C showed me that he had found a newspaper from 1979 on the floor and he had taken it as a souvenir. I, being the more superstitious type, demanded that he get rid of it though. I didn't want any potential haunted objects or bad vibes in my car, and so he tossed it out the window without too much coercing. It took us about 45 minutes to drive home, and since we were kind of shook, we decided to go to Denny's and rehash the experience. During the ride back, friend A fell asleep. This didn't concern me much at the time, but became an important factor to remember later on, so keep it in mind. So we get to Denny's and friends B and C went in ahead. I woke up friend A and asked him what happened, why did they run, and he said, well, we kind of saw something sitting at the end of the hallway, cross-legged on the floor. I think it was a man, and he was crying and kind of rocking back and forth, I think. He also explained that he thought the entity used his energy to manifest and that was why he was feeling so drained and fell asleep on the way back. We had a late dinner and then I drove everyone home afterwards. After I dropped off my last friend and was going back to my house, I distinctly felt someone pressing their knees into the back of the driver's seat. It's a familiar feeling if you take the bus in high school. Lots of people prop their knees up on the seat and the feeling is pretty much unmistakable. I yelped and sat straight up so that my back wasn't touching my chair, and I drove home faster when I realized that there was no one there. The very next day, I picked up my cousin to go see a movie together, and she blurted out to me that she thought that she saw someone in my back seat. I was obviously immediately horrified by this, as I had not confided in her the events from the night before. I asked her what seat, and she said, of course, behind the driver's seat. That night, I had a dream about a man too. He was Caucasian, mid-30s, brown hair, partially bald. He had brown eyes, and he was wearing a white cotton vest of some sort, which I found odd. I instinctively knew somehow too that it was the ghost my friends had seen at the hospital. In the dream, he was guiding me through a series of booby traps. He was holding me by the elbow and walking with me. He seemed kind of sweet and harmless. I thought that maybe he's a guardian or something. These dreams continued for about a week straight, and yes, they were really strange. Friends who didn't know about our trip to the asylum started to have experiences in my car as well. One friend heard and felt someone whisper in her ear. Another had their elbow grabbed by someone in the back seat. I felt the knees in my back on many occasions. In fact, I started to anticipate it and often drove without my back touching the seat at all. But one time, I even felt like someone was shaking my seat while I was driving, like hands on either side of the chair and just violently shaking it. And when the experiences and the dreams just didn't stop, I became pretty scared. I didn't feel like he was a guardian anymore, if that was ever the case in the first place, but finally, after about a week and a half of this, I sat down with friend A again. I asked him, "Hey, I know this is a bit of a weird question, but do you remember what he looked like or anything?" And he said, all I could see was that he was balding and I think he was wearing a white vest. I don't know how, but I think his name was David as well." I told my parents about what had happened after that, and they suggested that I tell David that he couldn't follow me anymore, to tell him to go to the light or whatever it is. I know that this all sounds crazy, but at this point I was honestly ready to do anything because I was on edge and spooked pretty much all the time. I prayed every time I came into the house that he wouldn't follow me in, and I was afraid to go out with my friends. I was afraid to go to sleep sometimes even, and so 2 weeks after our initial venture into the asylum, I went back with friend A. We went during the daytime and just kind of idled in front of the building, and then I said out loud, "Listen, if there's someone here, you don't belong here with me. You need to go home." Or something along those lines anyway. I prayed a lot and I just didn't want him anymore, and I felt bad, but I needed him to stay here. So we parked and just kind of sat there quietly for a while. I think friend A and I were just saying goodbye, I suppose, severing ties. I don't know, but it felt sad, and while we were parked, I did hear doors slamming inside the building. And at one point, I even heard someone laughing too. I envisioned him leaving me in my car, and I told him that he could never follow me again. He needed to go, and he needed to move on. We left the hospital that day, and we didn't go back for many, many years. I never did dream of him again after that, and I've never told anyone the full story before for 2 reasons. One being that it sounds just totally ridiculous, I know. And 2, because I'm afraid that thinking about him too much will send some sort of psychic beacon out to attract him or something else back to me, when that's totally the opposite of what I want. So, I moved across the country a few months ago for school, and I live in an off-campus apartment that's leased by the school. I've been having some just really strange and frightening occurrences in this apartment, and I have to tell someone about it and hopefully get some insight on what the hell I should do. The first thing I remember happening was very mild, as most paranormal experiences start out. I was lying in my bed drawing when I saw a motion out of the corner of my eye, and when I looked up, my bathroom door handle slowly turned and the door opened. Mind you, it has a long handle, so I could clearly see it turn, and this door is a pain in the ass to open, let alone on its own, so it was weird. I just kind of stared in disbelief for a couple of seconds. A million rationalizations were running through my mind, and I just couldn't make sense of any of them. I don't remember being scared, but I was just kind of confused. And this particular door opens on its own every single day without fail, and multiple people have claimed that they felt something tug on the door when they try to close it too. I've also had some absolutely horrifying sleep paralysis episodes here, which might not be related, but I feel are worth noting, where a tall shadowy figure emerges from that door and creeps towards me until its hands are around my neck and I'm gasping for air. But side note too, I've made it a habit to close the door whenever I leave, and after I regain consciousness from these episodes, sometimes the door will be open again. That could just be me being forgetful though, at least that's what I tell myself sometimes.
but doors opening in nightmares weren't even the beginning of it though. So one night, my roommates and I were in our living room when all of a sudden there was a giant cluttering sound coming from my room. It honestly sounded as if someone was rummaging through my stuff really violently. We all looked at each other and immediately thought someone broke in, so we armed ourselves and cracked open the door, only to find no one in the room and all of my belongings scattered everywhere around my room. For instance, my tapestries were torn down, my makeup was thrown around every corner of my room, and my bedsheets were even ripped off. I've had a lot of paranormal occurrences in the past, but in that moment I experienced a fear that I've never felt before. My roommates and I saged our apartment after that, and things were okay, for a while at least. Aside from my door opening and the occasional fallen object, things quieted down for a bit. I became heavily involved in my schoolwork and didn't really have time to think about demons and all that. They were really the least of my problems, if I'm being honest. But today, things have begun to escalate. As I was sitting in my class, my roommate walked in with a startled look on her face and said, "Hey, I thought you hadn't left yet." I raised my eyebrow and she explained that she was leaving our apartment when she heard her name being called from my room. She responded with yes, but didn't get a reply, so she just left. Now, my roommate is not one to make stuff up like that, and her and her family are very cognizant of the paranormal world. I told her that was really strange and hoped it was just a one-time thing, but apparently not. We got home from class today and all of our cupboards were open and both of our bedroom doors, they were definitely locked. We exchanged our what the hell looks and went to investigate. We searched the apartment for something or someone, but to no avail. We met back in our kitchen and talked about what was happening when all of a sudden we heard a loud crash come from her room. Simultaneously, we stopped conversing and I said, "You heard that too, right?" So cliche, I know, but she immediately went towards the sound and discovered that her bathroom door, the closet door, the washer and the dryer were all open. And upon seeing this, we didn't say a word and just casually left the apartment and haven't been back since. And so, my question to you guys is, what the hell do I do in this situation? I have 10 weeks of school left, and unfortunately switching apartments and moving out isn't an option. I would be really thankful for any answers or any guidance here because this whole situation seems to be escalating. So, I've never really told anyone this story before. I've lurked watching stories for a while now, but I thought that it was time that I share my experience. These events took place way back in 1994, and my wife and I were separated during this time, and I was frequently travelling between my home with her and where I was staying at the time. So the night in question, we had a huge argument, and I left to go back to my place. I didn't want to take the interstate, so I often drove through the country. It always seemed to give me time to think and relax after seeing her and getting so upset anyway. I turned on Mallard Creek Church Road sometime around 2:30 in the morning, and as I approached the church the road is named for, I realized that I had to pee, like, right then. Now, there's a road across the street from the church, and it's a dead end with a few houses at the end of it. I turned in and drove perhaps 100 yards and cut off the car and cut off all the lights so that no one could be suspicious of what I was doing. I was just going to walk over to the edge of the woods and pee. As soon as I let my stream flow, though, I thought I heard something whisper something. Not sure what. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I heard it again, and it said, "You don't belong here." And at this point, I zipped up while I was still pissing and started moving back towards the car. But whatever it was said again, "You don't belong here," but much louder than before. I was so scared that I ran as fast as I could the last few feet to the car,
Or whatever was doing the talking or loud whispering did say something else too, but I was too busy moving and getting keys out of my pocket that I couldn't tell you what it said. I'll tell you too that those few seconds trying to get in the car and get it started and get out of there seemed like it was in super slow motion. I did go back a few days later in the daytime and there was nothing to see, just some woods across the street from an old church. I drove down the road to the end and there's just a few houses back there. I have long wondered and scratched my head as to what happened that night. Was someone out walking the road and decided to mess with a stranger just stopping to relieve himself on the side of the road? Or did I really not belong there? I have not had many paranormal experiences in my life, but this is one that I just can't explain, and therefore I'm asking you guys for your input on what might have happened. So, I've always been a bit of a skeptic, probably because deep down I'd rather believe that these things just don't exist. Life is complicated enough as it is, if you get me. But anyways, here's the story. I'm from a small village in Scotland that is northwest of Glasgow. My family have a small holiday cottage on the Isle of Coll. If you feel like it, you can have a look on Google Maps to get an idea of where it is. My father's mother was born on this island, and her blood can be traced back to the 1600s on that island. The island only has around 200 inhabitants currently, but it's thought that it used to be about 1,000 or so. At its longest, it's around 12 miles or so, and at its widest, it's around 3 miles. There are countless stories and folk tales of people seeing unnatural things on this island, seeing glimpses of battles that happened hundreds of years ago, or seeing old workers walking through your farmhouse who aren't really there. You get the idea, I suppose, but most people who have lived in these houses have lived in there for a very long time, and some energies have obviously been left behind. Our cottage used to be in the dairy and cheese section. The barns around the house still have all the slots where the cows would stay. It's a really old cottage and has had many owners before us. It was last used as a dairy in the 70s. Fun fact too is that its cheese was once exported into the house lords of London. Now, when I was around 10, we extended the small cottage into some ruined piggeries that were attached to the end of the cottage. But we probably disturbed some old spirits or something when we knocked through those old walls, but it had to be done. The renovation meant that me and my sister now both had a bedroom each, which was nice, I must admit. But my bedroom was pretty much empty apart from some bunk beds at the far end away from the door. For the first year or so, I would feel a bit off about the pitch-black room when trying to go to sleep. But it was when I was around 12 that I saw her for the first time. She was around my age, stood in the middle of the room, a light from across the courtyard beaming in from a slit in my curtain, hitting the side of her face and body. And clear as day, she was there, stood in the middle of my room. As soon as I saw her, I immediately panicked and turned to face the wall. I spent the rest of that night covered in sweat and shaking in fear, and I knew what I had seen. I continued to see her now and again, sometimes 2 days in a row. She eventually became an unexpected feature in my room, to me at least, and it got to the point where I could peacefully fall asleep with her in the room because I knew from experience that all she ever did was stand there. She meant no harm. She was just kind of part of the room as the stonework around her was. I also had a close friend come out to the island when I was around 14. I had not told him about her, but upon going to bed on the first night, we were there and I saw her arrive in the middle of the room. I also knew that he was still awake as we had just been talking. He was on the top bunk and I was on the bottom one, but there was just dead silence. I didn't say anything, and neither did he. The next morning, he seemed a bit off too, and after probing a few times, he finally admitted that he thought that he saw a girl in our room the night before. I must admit that I was a bit scared by this, but also kind of relieved that somebody else had seen her finally, because it meant that I wasn't going crazy. I told him about how I'd been seeing her there for years now, and that this little girl really was there. When I was around 15, I made an effort to communicate with her once while she was visible and talk her through the transition of moving on. Not talking with words, but speaking without talking, almost pleading with her, telling her that she had nothing to fear about moving on.
I told her that there was no benefit to her being stuck here where she was, and she just walked out of my room through my closed door. And that was the last time that I ever saw her. So, time went on, and my dad was on a boat going to Cole one day when I was around 15 or 16. A family member of ours had unfortunately died and was being buried on the island that day. My dad was sat in the lounge area of the boat and just by chance started speaking with an elderly man who was sat across from him. It turned out to be the guy who owned our cottage back in the 70s and 80s. Apparently, he had sold the cottage to the person who sold it to us. By this point, my dad knew that I had seen this little girl in my room on many occasions, and it turns out that this elderly man had a daughter, and unfortunately she died of TB, tuberculosis, at a young age. She was around 9 or 10, and she used to look after the pigs in the piggeries that we knocked into and renovated. She's buried on Tyree, the island next to Cole, and my dad didn't say anything to the man when he heard this, but it immediately clicked in his head. This was the young girl that I'd been seeing. Eventually, though, my dad brings a psychic out to the island to see what she picks up on. He hadn't told her about the little girl or anything, and she's very sensitive to these sorts of things and is well known for clearing buildings and smudging, etc. They arrived at the cottage during daylight, and I've never seen the little girl during the day, but as soon as our friend walks through the doorway of my room, she freezes and starts talking. She said, "There has been a young girl visible in this room recently, maybe around 10 years old. Is this your son's room now?" He said yes, and she said, "Has he ever seen her?" He said, "I'm not sure," and she said, "I think he's helped her move on, but I'm not sure how, because she has moved on." This, I must admit, was further validation for me that, again, I wasn't going crazy and that my friend and I actually did see something. Like I said at the beginning, though, I'm still very much a skeptic, and there could be possible other answers, I know. And so, I look forward to hearing some feedback from you guys. Thanks. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest where you left your doors unlocked and just came home when the streetlights turned on for dusk. After moving away for college, I decided to move back to my quiet, sleepy hometown in one of the 2 apartment buildings. I'm living there for roughly 3 months when one night I go to sleep early on a Friday night. Now, I'm a reasonably hard sleeper, so when I wake in the middle of the night to noises, I'm immediately alarmed. I'm going to describe my apartment layout for a better understanding as well. So, as you walk in the front door, the kitchen is to the left and the living room is to the right. There's a hallway straight ahead with one bedroom at the end. A bathroom is to the left in the hall and my bedroom is to the right. I get up from my bed and walk around to the end of the bed and peek my head out of the bedroom door. I look to the left to see my front door open to the outside hallway. There's also a loud voice coming from the enlightened kitchen. From my vantage point, though, I'm unable to see into my kitchen. And honestly, I froze. This fact is something that I've left out of the telling of this story since. It's not something that I'm proud of for sure, but I want to relay this story in its entirety. It may have only been a couple of heartbeats, but to me it just felt like an eternity. So, I eventually come to my senses though after realizing that I've stopped unconsciously breathing. I take a shallow breath to steady my mind and gather my bravery. There's no thought process about what to do at this point, but I let my body and my instincts take over. I turn around and head back to the far side of my bed. I grab my phone from the nightstand and quietly remove it from the charger. Luckily, my bed frame is high enough for me to squeeze under without much difficulty. I immediately realize, though, that there is no escape from my hiding spot if things turn south. I'll just have to rely on my luck to eventually get through this. I dial 911 and a woman answers and asks about my emergency. I briefly explain in a whisper that an unknown man is in my apartment and that I'm currently safe. I lay there listening to the chaos in my home, reassured by the presence of my cat, Marcy, laying under the bed with me. It seems to me that the person in my house is on a phone call based on the one-sided rambling. I tell the operator this fact and explain my fear that he's going to bring other people into my home. He was making enough sound to allow me to give a play-by-play on the call, kind of. He starts screaming about killing someone, and at this point, I'm unsure whether he's talking to the person on the phone or if he knows that I'm there. The voice is unfamiliar, but this does little to ease my terror. He then starts ringing the doorbell in the outside hallway and yelling for me to come out. My blood runs cold as I realize that he might come to try and find me too. Marcy is alarmed by the doorbell that doesn't cease ringing, and she creeps out from under the bed. I panic because, well, what if he hurts her? So I start whispering as loudly as possible to get her attention without letting him know my location. She senses my unease and crawls back under the bed with me though. At this point, it's felt like an eternity has passed, and I ask the operator how long until the police arrive. She's unsure, but assures me that they're definitely on their way. My town is roughly a 30-minute drive to the nearest city police, but I assume there's a highway patrol that would be coming soon. Little did I know, though, that safety was in to rush to get me. I hear him walking around my apartment and enters my extra bedroom, which is my storage room with a bed. He hasn't stopped yelling, and I'm still unaware whether he's on the phone or not. I hear him mention that it must be a kid's room. I shush the operator because he ceased his screaming for the moment. I hear more noises, like he's going through boxes and throwing things. And then my fear is realized as I hear him quietly enter my room. I see his feet walk to my closet from my vantage point. He starts going through my clothes and emptying my hamper onto the floor. He turns around and walks to my bed and sits down, and at this point, I just stopped breathing. I think he lays down at this point since the pressure of the bed lessens on top of me. He's deadly silent, and I'm still holding my breath. They're shuffling and moving around, and he gets up and walks out of the room. I take a shallow breath and steady my conviction. He starts making noise again, like he's throwing and punching things or something, and I inform the operator that he was just in my room and the police need to hurry. I didn't know how long I could keep Marcy under the bed and was concerned about what would happen if he actually did find me. He walks back into the kids' room quietly. I shush the operator again because she is continually asking me for a play-by-play, and I hear him breathing from the other room. After the quietest few minutes of my life, he yells, "Who's there?" and I freeze again, listening for a moment. But nothing. I'm starting to get lightheaded from my shallow breathing. The silence is deafening, and I fear that he's trying to detect me. After a lifetime, I hear footsteps entering my apartment. I hear a man's voice say, "Hey bud, you're in the wrong house, man." And I've never felt more relief in my life before this night or since. I hear my door close and I crawl out from under the bed and break down. The adrenaline and anxiety just takes over as soon as the feeling of safety washes over me. A female officer comes around to my side of the bed and puts her hands on my shoulders. I'm trying to keep it together and just failing miserably though. She let me put my clothes on, and I could hear 3 male voices coming from my apartment. The woman left and came back with a handful of clothes, asking if any weren't mine. They all were, and I answered in kind. She shut the door behind her as she left again. I turned and looked out my window and see no lights from the cop car on the street. I look at my phone and realize the call to 911 took 19 minutes. I can't explain the feelings that I had at this time since many hit me all at once. The door opened and the officer motioned to have me exit, and taking a first look at my home was almost as anxious as the event itself. But my apartment was just a complete mess, to put it simply. Clothes were everywhere, mixed with garbage and other belongings from my shelves and counters. This man had removed items that he had intended on taking apparently and placed them in the outside hallway. They tell me that they had found him on the floor in the second room, completely naked, holding a bottle of lotion. In this vicinity, there was also a winter hat with an unknown substance inside. The officer was kind enough to throw that in the garbage bag immediately, and they tell me to look and see if any of the clothes in the apartment don't belong to me. I tell them no, but apparently this man entered my home completely naked and just proceeded to destroy my home. I noticed that the lid of my garbage can was filled with cat poo, and it seems that it had been separated from the rest of the bag. The rest of the garbage was littering the outside hallway. They asked me if I would like to stay here or go elsewhere, and thankfully my parents lived down the street and I had an officer drive me there. I explained to my parents what had just happened, and in the next few days I have to explain this situation to what felt like half the town. The ridiculousness of this story catches people's attention and becomes a bit of a slight joke as well. I play along, attempting to be lighthearted, but I'm unable to disassociate from the horror that I faced that night. I know now that I should feel better knowing that he is in custody, but the events after the break-in do little to comfort me, if I'm being honest. An officer shows up with a subpoena to appear in court to testify, but I receive a call for a postponement. I just wanted this to be behind me, but that was not going to be. Because after a month, I finally call the phone number on the paper that I received and ask when they're rescheduling for, since I hadn't heard anything. The woman informs me that they apparently mailed another and I had just not shown up. I asked, where was it sent, since I have not received a summons? She tells me that they sent it to my address, but the wrong town. It honestly blew my mind a bit. I mean, how can they not know where I live? The crime actually happened right there. She also tells me that he pled guilty and was given 180 days. And I was furious. This man would get out in a short 8 weeks for attempting to steal and entering my home? She reassured me that he also received another 180 days for a previous bench warrant that he had. But what justice is there that someone with priors gets a short 3 months for traumatizing a stranger? Anyway, after his release, I kept track of his location using the sex offender registry. He had relations with a child years prior, apparently, and it makes his statements about the kids' room just even more unsettling. He was arrested yet again for a 4th DUI shortly after his release and sentenced to 5 years with 2 suspended. I was happy for a while. I mean, my nightmares had ended, right? But the tension that I felt during my waking hours, although it lessened, it just never went away. It's been 2 years since this happened, and I've since moved 3 times. I don't know if I'll ever be content and happy anywhere, but I'm hoping that I'll find it someday. He was released 6 months after his conviction for some reason or another on parole. He immediately disappeared and fled from his parole officer and sex offender registry, and I'm currently planning a cross-country move to try and rest my mind. And I'm hoping to, someday at least, grow out of all the nightmares. I had an encounter in December of last year that left me feeling just really unsettled. I was in a vulnerable position as my partner and I, both female and homeless, had purchased an RV to live in but were having trouble finding a spot to rent because it was an older model and we have pets. We parked in the farthest corner of the Walmart parking lot in Bend, OR, around 10 a.m. one day, and my partner had errands that needed to be run and took a bus to do such as I head down the fort and watch the dogs. It was going to be a long day of waiting around for her to get back so we could leave. I went into the store twice to make some purchases earlier in the day. I worked on some maintenance and art before getting bored enough to just take a nap. And as I was taking the dogs outside beforehand, 2 police officer vehicles pulled up and parked right next to the RV. At this point, I'm preparing for them to ask me to move the vehicle or tell me that I can't park overnight or something. But after a while of nothing, I fell asleep anyway. When I woke up, I could tell it was getting toward the evening. But the sun was still very much up, and considering the police presence too, I wasn't particularly in the mindset of anything bad happening. Still, I always carry my pepper spray on me, and my partner wasn't back yet, although I did expect her late. She had her only phone, so I went into the store to check the time. The officers had moved already at this point, and the parking in the general area was pretty barren, save for 1 van parked in the spot right behind the RV. I entered the store and went to the restroom in the front. Then I walked to the electronics department to see what time it was on the displays. It was a few minutes before 6 p.m. and I left after only being there for a few minutes.
As I was walking out the door, the crowd in front of me slowly dispersed to veer toward their respective vehicles. I continued walking behind one man who seemingly parked in the same direction as me. He was tall, thin, and scraggly with shoulder-length blonde hair and a black hoodie. I walked maybe 30 feet behind him the whole way, and as he passed all the cars by the front of the store, I came to the conclusion that he must be the owner of the van by my RV. He walked with clear direction, not looking around for where his car was or pretty much anything. After passing the main crowd of the parking lot, I got my pepper spray out of my pocket and held it in my hand as a routine safety measure that I just do. After passing the main crowd of the parking lot, I got my pepper spray out of my pocket and held it in hand as a routine safety measure. The man walked between the back of the RV and the driver's side door of the van. I figured he was about to get in, but instead he lingered. I stopped walking in that direction at this point and headed toward a more populated parking area at the next store across the street, since it was closer than Walmart from this end. Then he looked at me and we made eye contact for a minute. It felt like he recognized me, as if he'd been staking me out or something and was surprised to see me leaving the store so soon. I continued to walk away while staring at him, and he watched me before slipping around the side of my RV where there were some bushes and a fence with no outlet. And it was at this point that I noped the hell out of there. So I go into another store and walk around blankly, just kind of staring at things for a bit, trying to formulate a plan. It's pretty busy in there with no one at the customer service desk, so I go into the gas station next door and I ask to use the phone. I call my partner to explain the situation and tell her not to go directly to the RV. Then I headed back into Walmart, got a coffee at the McDonald's inside, and waited there for another hour until she was able to return. Perhaps I should have called the police, I know that, but as I was worried about my animals, the little dog would bark, but they're not guard dogs by any means, and my possessions being stolen, I just didn't do anything. But I had recently called 911 while witnessing domestic violence a few days prior, only to have them take 2 hours to show up in the middle of downtown. I was worried that they would not only not help, but possibly harass me for just parking there. I don't have a driver's license too, so having to move the RV before my partner returned would be a really dangerous situation. When she arrived, we went to the RV together and the van was gone. Nothing was touched, despite one of the windows not locking properly, but weirdly, the pets seemed really spooked. Maybe they decided against stealing after I caught them or something, but I'm not well off, that's for sure, and honestly, one look at the beat-up old thing would tell you that I don't have much worth taking. Thinking back on it, though, when I remember the look in that guy's eyes, I feel like he wasn't really after material possessions, though. Either way, I'm really happy that I'll never have to find out. This happened about 7 years ago. I was 16 years old at the time and was home alone with my only younger sister, Nadine, who was 9 at the time. Our only parent was my mum, and she worked a full-time graveyard shift, 10 to 7, and we had easily become accustomed to it because we usually would be asleep or at school whenever she was working. Every night was the same: get home from school, homework, shower, say goodbye to my mum, and then go to sleep. Often, me and my sister would stay up late despite my mother's orders, but nothing crazy pretty much ever happened. We lived in an upstairs 2-bedroom apartment. At night, me and Nadine would barricade ourselves in our mother's room, lock the door, and go to sleep. We were always too scared to sleep in separate rooms. Our mother had the key to every door in the apartment. This specific night, me and Nadine were in the living room watching yet another Family Guy episode. It was getting late, close to midnight, and we definitely had school the next day, so it was time for bed. As we were preparing for bed, someone knocked on the front door of the apartment. Now, this apartment complex had 2 doors, one metal door on the outside and then the door made of wood, which was technically inside. Therefore, one would have to unlock 2 doors before they could get to it. I looked at Nadine as if to say, "Is Mum home early?" I put my ear to the door, and then they knocked again. "Who is it?" I said through the door. No response. I ordered Nadine to call Mum, but there was no answer, so I looked through the peephole and I couldn't see anything. It was dark, and whoever it was wasn't tall enough to see, even a silhouette. Nadine went to unlock the door, and I yelled, "Stop!" My mum always told me that she would call for an emergency, and she has the keys to the apartment, so she would have no reason to knock. Before I could come up with a plan, though, whoever was on the other side of the door began pounding on the door. They were no longer knocking, and it sounded like someone was banging on the door with a closed fist. As if on cue, Nadine and I ran to my mother's room and locked the door. Nadine began to cry. I tried to console her, but I was honestly scared too. I waited a few moments in hopes that they would go away, or my mum would call to yell at us to open the door or something. About 2 minutes passed, and my mother called us back. She saw that we called her and took a break as soon as she could call, because she was at work. I told her about the knocking, and she urged us not to exaggerate, but whoever it was gone for now, and we were okay. She blamed it on perhaps a lone drunk or someone looking for trouble or something. Regardless, though, she said, "Do not open the door." She hung up, and then we just got into bed. I was tossing and turning, and it had been about an hour since the knocking first began, when suddenly there were 3 bangs. Nadine and I shot up because the knocking was now at our bedroom door. There were no lights on in the apartment, which spooked me further, because who was in our home that wouldn't turn them on? I called my mum. She answered on the first ring, and I nearly yelled at her, "Mum, they're knocking at the bedroom door." I was in tears, beyond scared. Nadine had hid in the closet, and while my mum was on the phone, they pounded on the door again, and I extended my arm out with the phone in hand so that she could hear. The pounding was so intense that I felt like at any moment now they would break through the lock on the door and rush in. She called 911 and came home that night straight away, and when she reached the front door, both doors were locked. The officers searched the home for any signs of entry, which wasn't likely since we were on the upstairs level, and nothing was ever found. Nadine and I still talk about this stuff sometimes because if it hadn't have happened to both of us, I don't think anyone would have ever believed us. Because I know that I sure wouldn't believe it. I'd like to start off by saying that this is not my story, but the story of a co-worker's. My buddy, who I'll call Josh, is the son of a priest. He told me a story recently that honestly scared me, so I wanted to share it with you guys. So Josh is in his mid-30s currently, but this story takes place when he was 10 years old. He said that one day when he was hanging out with his dad, a man came to visit his dad at home. When the man arrived, Josh's father told him to go into another room while his father and the man talked. Josh, being the curious kid that he was though, left the room but kept the door to the room slightly cracked so that he could hear what the adults were going to talk about. Josh said that a few minutes into their conversation, all seemed pretty normal, but it all quickly changed. He said that the man who came to visit his dad was having a normal conversation when all of a sudden the guy's voice just changed dramatically. Josh said that the guy's voice would change while talking to his dad, so much so that Josh thought that there were 3 people in the room talking instead of 2. He said that the man's other voice kept getting louder and meaner as it changed. He said the man would be calm, talking normally, and then he would just start yelling horrible things. Then he would calm down and speak softer again. At this point, the man would speak in his normal voice, then switch mid-sentence to a loud, angry voice every minute or so. He said that at some point, he heard the man say to his father in a distorted voice, "I'm going to kill you." And Josh, freaked out at this, shut the door and ran to his room until the 2 were finished talking. Not long after this, the man finally left and Josh went back to talk to his dad. He asked his dad what had happened with that man, but he told Josh not to worry about it and that he just had to help the man with something. To this day, Josh thinks that his father had performed some sort of ritual or exorcism to rid this man of a demon of sorts. He said that it's the scariest thing that he ever witnessed, hands down, and also that after this day he became a firm believer in the paranormal. This happened 10 years ago, so I'm going to try and remember this as best as possible. I was reminded of this by a recent news story in my neighborhood. So 10 years ago, I was working my very first job, which was retail. The store location was not in a very good neighborhood. The theft and violence was pretty bad here, but I needed the money desperately. I had to walk every afternoon, and my mother would pick me up in the evenings. That day, however, my boss scheduled for me to have a morning shift on the weekend, so I went in early and got out in the afternoon. Which means that this takes place when I was walking home after work. So I was walking down the sidewalk on the road when I just got a bad feeling in my stomach. I turned my head slightly when I noticed someone was behind me. I told myself that he was just walking in the same direction as me, but the bad feeling just wasn't going away. I'm a pretty paranoid person as it is, so I told myself that I was just overreacting. And well, we kept walking down the same road, and after a few moments, I took a peek over my shoulder again, and he was much closer now. I began to shake at this and internally panic, I must admit. Up ahead, I saw a gas station and decided to change direction and head inside of it instead. Rather than stay on the sidewalk too, I cut into a parking lot that made it a straight shot into the gas station. Hoping the guy would stay on the sidewalk, I took another peek behind me, and the guy was still following me, and now even closer than before. I began to visibly panic as the guy was practically right behind me at this point, and before I could just make a run for it, a large van pulled into the parking lot and pulled up right next to me. The window went down, and I almost cried in relief because it was my parents in their van. And my mum said, "Hey kid, want to ride home?" And I rushed to the other side of the van and jumped in. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I looked back and the guy watched me for a minute, then went back to the sidewalk and walked back down the road, not even heading into the gas station anymore. Apparently, my parents saw how close the guy was, and my dad even cut someone off to get into the parking lot before the guy could touch me. I honestly didn't even notice them coming until they pulled up right next to me. One of the biggest things that scared me was not only the guy almost grabbing me, but this happened in pretty much broad daylight. It wasn't even in the evening yet, and there were cars going down the road randomly, and even people going in and out of the gas station not too far from us. I don't know whether he was planning to just mug me or something worse, but I thank God, or whatever higher power is out there, that my parents got to me first. Also, I started taking another route home during the day after that, and I never saw the same guy again. So this happened to me just this week. Tuesday night was prom night, and me and my girlfriend had a whole day planned together, but part of that day involved a hike, which ultimately was just an excuse to make out, I must admit. But we met at my house, and then she and I biked a few miles down to a hiking trail. When we got to the park, we locked up our bikes to the fence around the parking lot. There was no bike racks, and then we walked up the trailhead. We walked up the trail a bit, and then found a log that was a bit off the trail and sat down. The park was actually pretty deserted. We saw one couple walking their dog on the trail, but other than that, nobody was there. There were only 3 or 4 cars in the lot as well, but as we were resting, we see this guy in a blue checkered shirt. For the purpose of the story, we'll call him Blue as well. He looked like he was maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, was quite tall and skinny and had a long face. Without trying to be too harsh, he did look kind of like a stereotypical meth head from a TV show, though I didn't really get a druggy vibe from him at all. He walked by us on the trail. We were maybe 20 or 30 feet from the trail, and as he walked, he kept kind of glancing over at us. We were just chatting at this point and figured that maybe he's seen us kissing and was kind of grossed out or something, so we dismissed it as him just feeling uncomfortable. Then, a few minutes later, another man walks up the trail. We'll call him White because he was wearing a white shirt. I know, my names are so original, right? Anyway, He was shorter and stockier than Blue and looked like he was in his mid to late 30s, I would say. However, unlike Blue, his glances at us were much more pronounced and noticeable. He seemed to be really inspecting us, rather than uncomfortably passing us like Blue did. And at this point, she and I got a bit creeped out, but dismissed it in a similar fashion to Blue. Now, here's where things started to get creepy though. A little while later, White passes by again. This time, he's really taking a long look at us, turning his whole body as he walks away to stare. She and I decide that it's time to start moving, so we walk up a trail a bit, hoping White will leave now that he was headed back to the lot. But as we walk up the trail, who do we pass but Blue again, coming towards us? As we pass him, he also makes a remark to us. "Hey, be careful up there. I saw a couple of deer up the trail." I knew the park quite well. My dad runs there often, and I know that deer aren't all that dangerous. Unless it's a stag, of course, which he should have mentioned, right? So his remark begins to set off a few warning bells for sure. Something's definitely not right here, but again, I dismiss him as just an awkward person, and she and I continue up the trail. But after 100 feet or so, she and I both get the same bad feeling that something is seriously off here. And so we just turn around and we head back towards the bikes. But we try to talk about other stuff so that we aren't scared of what's going on, but as we pass a fork in the trail, we see Blue walking towards us again. He comes from behind us along the other trail as well, and then begins to tail us, walking quite close behind us. And it was uncomfortably close as well. But the whole time he's pretending to look at his phone, but I know it's just pretend. He's definitely focused on us. She and I pretend not to notice though, and talk about how we wish we could have seen the deer and found it, and talk about experiences we've had with the deer. We're almost at the parking lot now, and I'm honestly itching to get out of there when who do we see sitting on the bench at the end of the trail but White? Now, the trail ended right where White was sitting, but a fork went sharply left and dumped us out a bit farther down the lot, so I pulled Girlfriend in that direction and we walked rather quickly to the bikes without turning around. When we get there, I notice Blue and White standing next to each other, and then Blue starts walking towards us again. I'm rushing to undo the bike lock, and luckily Blue isn't walking too fast, so I'm able to unlock the bikes and get on. She and I rushed out of there without looking back, so I'm not really sure what happened to Blue. We don't know what they wanted with us, whether it was an abduction attempt or just trying to scare us away from a drug deal or something, but it was definitely creepy and they were up to something for sure. My childhood home was in a desolate place surrounded by forests. I have my fair share of strange stories, but this one scared me the most. So I was home alone at night as my mum and stepdad had gone out to the store. This wasn't that strange because I was 15, so perfectly capable of staying alone for an hour or two. But then something started pounding on the front door. I thought it was my stepdad at first, that maybe they'd forgotten their key or something. I got up to let them in, but then I saw my two little dogs, and they normally ran up to the door and barked at anyone there. Instead, they were looking up at me from the couch with something that I can't explain in their eyes. I had a bad feeling about everything, so I chose not to open the door, and instead I hid in my bedroom and called my mum. And of course, she didn't answer. But the weird thing is that I didn't hear the phone at the door either, which meant that it definitely wasn't them. But the knocking on the door quickly stopped and moved to my bedroom window at this point. I had a tapestry hanging in front of it, so I couldn't see outside at whatever was knocking. But I started to really panic, and after another minute or two, my mum answered the phone. The knocking totally stopped then, and the bad feeling that I had just disappeared. The strange thing is that we have outside dogs, and if a person or large animal had come into my yard, they would have gone just crazy barking at them. There was also a bunch of mud in front of my window, but there were no footprints in it. Now, I'm normally a very skeptical person, but I still can't explain this years later.
It's definitely changed my mind about ever living in a rural area, but a lot of people have suggested things like wasps or moths before. But I always told them that this happened in the middle of winter, so there weren't really any bugs around. I didn't live in an area with bugs big enough to make that loud of a sound anyway. I should also mention too that one of the scariest things about this was how human the knocking sounded. To be specific, whatever it was knocked the exact way that my stepfather did, as in he would go from the door to my bedroom window to get my attention. The whole situation was quite frightening at the time and pretty creepy when I think about it, and something that I don't think that I'll ever forget. So my mum and dad, like every young couple, has a goal to make the neat investment of purchasing their first home. But they had found one too in a small rural town in Kansas, a large, to their surprise, newly built house. At the time we moved in, I was fairly young, so obviously I didn't follow the buy process, but after a while my parents explained that the house was pretty oddly priced down. The realtor at the time did explain that the house had a long history before it was built. However, my parents jumped on it. The family that actually owned it previously was still around, and it told my sister too that it was built on an Indian cemetery. There were multiple in the area apparently. Another one was right next to my grandparents' house too. But anyways, here's the weird stuff. So, there were multiple spirits that roamed the house. Activity acted up frequently, and here's a few examples. It all kind of started when my older sister and her friends would scream in fear as pop cans would just start spinning or yoga balls would roll across the room. We believe it was a young boy who roamed about doing little shit things like this. My other sister would yell at my mum to tell me to stop running up and down the stairs, but I would be at a friend's house. I saw the boy a lot too. I would sit in the living room and look at the stairs to only be greeted by a purple apparition of a boy looking back at me. It was pretty terrifying to see him, I must admit. I would build Legos too all the time, and sometimes I would return to them just completely pieced apart. Not only was it scary, but they just kind of pissed me off too. I mean, you never mess with another person's Legos, right? There were also just a ton of more little stories, but I want to get to the ones that I'll never forget. So one night it was kind of stormy, just flashing lightning and some rain. It was about 2 in the morning and I'm watching TV on my couch. My mum was asleep on the other, and I start to hear our 3 dogs outside going just bonkers. They were small dogs, but they were growling like I'd never heard before. I look at my window to see something glowing a faint blue on the ground. I had no idea what the hell it was, but I start to notice humanly features, specifically a rib cage, and then I see a glowing human corpse. I scream for my mum, and she looks and gets my dad, who is also now looking at this mutilated person. They go to contact the police, and I was told to go to their room for now, and after a few minutes they came back and said that it had just disappeared. There are some more stories about this house and town too. I've encountered a lot with family and friends there. True head scratches indeed, but I'll stop here for now, and I hope you enjoyed. I live in FL with my mum most of the time and fly up to WI to live with my dad during school breaks. I'm 18 now and fresh out of high school, and this will probably be my last time to visit my dad's house for a few years in fact. I have an older sister, also in town for a bit, who's been looking for a new hobby and was interested in playing some classic Nintendo games, mainly Zelda. So, he got here about a week ago. I've been sick for almost a month with the flu and mono, so I've just been in bed for a while playing on my Switch, watching YouTube, or doing whatever else I can do. We live in a smallish house, and the basement is roughly the same size as the house too. My entire life, I've never really thought my basement was anything out of the ordinary. But lately, I've been questioning that. But being the irresponsible shit that I am, I'm up late pretty much every night, and I've been just hearing a bunch of creaking and bumping from the basement. I dismiss this as just my house being creaky my entire life, and more so on windy nights too.
But then, about an hour ago, I decided to go downstairs and get her old Wii or Xbox or something for my sister. She was at work at the moment, and so I was home alone. And while I was down there, I was hearing just an unusual amount of noise and creaks and whatnot. But for the life of me, I just could not find either system. Of course, I wasn't just looking for the systems. I was also looking through all the old stuff from when we were kids, old toys and books and movies and whatnot, along with old stuff from our late grandfather. He's been gone for a while now, and I don't think his stuff relates to him. But while looking at my dad's workbench, I saw an old toy airsoft revolver, or one from before they had to have the orange tip on them. Long broken, but I picked it up, and while I was looking at it, I saw what looked like a large man out of the corner of my eye. I quickly turned, revolver in hand, to see nothing and nobody there. Okay, that was strange, but I dismissed it and put the thing down. At this point, I also noticed that the various lights around the basement weren't all on in the way that I'd remembered them. But once again, I dismissed it, and finally, while looking around, I looked into an old mirror, and as I did, I was poked in the head by something. And I turned around to see an orange Nerf dart freshly fallen on the floor. At this point, I was obviously spooked, so I hit up my girlfriend to tell her about this. I paced around the basement a few times while texting her everything that happened, and I eventually looped back to the mirror, and this time, I see it. It's a green disc of sorts, and I watch it fly over my shoulder right at me. I ducked off to the side and watched it hit the mirror and then just disappear behind the old bins. At that point, I casually walk up the stairs with that feeling of just something behind me. I close the door and I decide to forget about the Wii for now. I'm 26 and female, but when I was 8 years old or so, and my two brothers, 10 and 6, something happened that would change everything for my family. So, both my parents were police officers, and I know that most people would think that there's nothing to be afraid of when your parents serve to protect. But my brothers and I, we were not prepared for what the next few years had in store for us. So, my parents' relationship began to get, well, rocky for a lack of a better term, when my stepdad reconnected with a woman that he knew. At first, it was just a friendship, so my dad thought anyway, but this woman wanted much, much more. To this day, I still don't know if it was an affair, but my parents are still together, so I assume that it wasn't. But this woman was obsessed with my dad. She began calling the house to talk to my dad, and this was pre-cell phone era, and when my mum tried to put a stop to it, she started leaving ungodly threatening voicemails on the answering machine. She was saying things like, "I'm going to slaughter you and your bastard children," meaning my older brother and I, "and then your husband will be mine." My dad blocked her number from the house phone, but then she started mailing sickening letters. It got to a point where my mum tried to get a restraining order, in fact. After a year or two, though, the letters stopped, until one night, my brothers and I are up playing games on our Super Nintendo in their room, just demolishing each other in Street Fighter or something, when we hear scratches at the bedroom window. Spooked, my little brother ran and told my mum. With gun cocked and loaded, she proceeds to check around the house, where she finds a knife where this woman tried to cut the screens of the windows. I guess trying to break in? After that, my mum installed a security system on the house, a really nice one too, and every entry of the house had to have a code to get in. And the alarm tripped a few times, but after that, nothing. A few months pass and we come home from the mall in Atlanta to find an envelope taped to the front door. And inside were pictures of the inside of our house, the Polaroid kind that you had to shake to develop, including a detailed message on how she would expose all of us. And after that, my parents sold the house and we just moved away. I must admit that it makes me sad too, because I really did love that house. So I worked in forest maintenance and forest ag for quite a while. Some friends owned a big plot of land in the Rocky Mountains, mountains. A group of us, all guys, 18 to 38 years of age, would gather together several times a year, go into the mountains for several days and clear scrub brush, make fire breaks, and, when appropriate, cut Christmas trees. This particular time it was early spring, and our crew of 9, on 3 Gator four-wheel drive vehicles, was at about 9,200 feet elevation, I would guess. There was a fairly significant amount of snow on the ground. We had put in a long day's work and were headed to camp, until the old guy of the crew asked if we wanted to head to the slope. This was a near treeless slope, free of any large rocks, about 100 yards wide. It also had tracks of big trees on either side. We would go there and, using one of the gators, tow a tube downhill in the snow, and it was really a lot of fun. So we got to the slope, set up a fire pit, cracked open the whiskey, and started having our fun. We all took several turns being towed, and Jeff was the new guy, and the youngest, 18. But we were giving him the craziest rides, swinging him close to the trees to kind of freak him out. A sort of initiation process, I guess. It was about 1 a.m. at this point, pitch black except for our dying fire and lightly snowing. Not the smartest or safest things I've ever done, but one of the most fun, that's for sure. Just as we were wrapping up on one of the last rides, though, and heading back to camp, Jeff freaked the hell out. He was stumbling over his words and couldn't express himself very clearly, but finally we got out of him that about 3/4 of the way down he had seen a man standing a few yards into the woods. He was wearing a trapper's hat, one of those ones with a flipped-up bill and ear flaps like in Fargo, and a plaid mackinaw. We were all a bit skeptical at first. I mean, we were on a big plot of private property at elevation in somewhat hostile weather. But we took the rifles off the gators and got our flashlights and gave it a look. And we didn't find anything, not even footprints. We ended up chalking it up to just inexperience, a spooky environment, and of course whiskey, and headed back to camp about 1/8 of a mile away, I suppose. But Jeff, he didn't sleep all night, and he was convinced that he saw someone. Eventually, though, the next morning came, and we drove the gators to the house on the property, got in our trucks, and headed into the little town nearby for breakfast. We had our breakfast, and were heading back to the property to say our goodbyes and go our separate ways, but as we neared the intersection of the public dirt road and the private dirt drive to the house, there were several police cars and an ambulance. We pulled over and stopped to talk to the police, who informed us that the closest neighbours had found a body in the ditch as they were heading down the mountain. Police had followed, in reverse, footprints up the hill to the slope and then across a neighbouring property to another perpendicular road. They asked if we knew anything, and of course we told them about the Mackinaw man. And sure enough, it was him. We still have no idea what was going on that night, if he was a danger to us, or if he could have been helped, or what. But poor Jeff in the end got his whiskey and meals paid for the next several weeks by all of us guys, but he still gets guff about it to this day. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but considered myself pretty skeptical. I figured that paranormal things happen to other people, but not me. My mum is a very talented psychic as well, which I didn't believe for the longest time until she started learning about it. And she always said that she had experiences in the house that I grew up in. They live in a newer home now, built in the 90s. In my old house, though, my parents, my brother, and me all had adjoining rooms. Mine was in the middle. Now, I always had bad nightmares in that room and felt off in it, but I just chalked it up to having my own room for the first time. One night, though, I was up too late on the internet and I heard a faint knock. I figured my brother needed something, so I went to open the door, but when I did, there was nothing there. I just kind of shrugged it off, and maybe I was just hearing things, and a few moments later I heard another knock, this time coming from the wall that my bed was on. It shared a wall with my brother's room, so I ignored it again until it picks up. The knocking started in the top corner of the wall and came down at an angle and would stop at where my head was. At this point, I must admit that I started to get freaked out, but I just tried to ignore it, thinking that it must have been my brother or something. But it kept happening, same pattern even, and eventually I thought that maybe it was the pipes. But I went to see if my brother was messing with me, and I went into his room to him being fast asleep, and realized that he had one of those massive IKEA bookshelves that covered the entire wall that was between our rooms anyway, which meant that there was physically no way that he could have been knocking that wall. So I decided to test it. When the knocking continued, I waited for it to stop by my head and knocked a similar pattern. And, to my shock, whatever it was knocked back. I was crying at this point, and I just tried to go to sleep, but the knocking continued the entire night, and after that night, it never came back. The next instance in this house was the voices in the basement. I heard people talking, and I figured someone had left the TV on downstairs. I ran downstairs to check it out, but there was nothing. The next day, my mum and my brother asked me if I'd been up watching TV. They had apparently heard voices in the hall, and we all described them as the same, a male and a female, talking in a loud whisper, saying things that we just couldn't understand. To my knowledge, these voices have been coming back once a week for about 7 years now as well. But 2 years ago, also, I moved out into a 1940s-era duplex with a few friends. I was superstitious and was told by my mum to never even look at a Ouija board. But I was drunk on Halloween night during our party, and my roommate had one, so we decided to use it in the cellar, dirt room in our basement. We tried it in my room first, and we got nothing. We didn't get much on the board itself besides it asking to talk to the 3 girls who lived in the house. Once we all got on the board, it just went dead silent, no matter where you used it. But my one roommate said that she felt dirty and needed to shower at like 3:30 a.m. So I sat at the chair that's near the bathroom to make sure she was okay, and about 15 minutes later, I hear a blood-curdling scream. I open the door and see her white as a ghost, slack-jawed, pointing at the mirror, and she had a simple 4-letter name that was drawn in ruler straight lines on the mirror backwards. I told her to stop playing tricks, and I attempted to recreate it, but for the life of me, I couldn't get the lines that straight, and the letters also immediately condensed. So I tried to scrub the original letters off to no avail. There was no residue, and they just wouldn't budge, and it took 4 days for it to fade, which was really weird. The next morning, though, the roommate who showered and I decided to give the board one more whirl to see if we could find out who was torturing us. Our other roommate was at work, so it was just us. We asked simple questions and got answers about who we were talking to, apparently an older man that was the original owner of the home. We asked why he was angry, and he just said A. My name and the roommate that was gone both have A names. I asked if I was the issue, and he said no. I asked why the other girl was an issue, and the board spelled out bitch so fast that we almost lost the planchette. Apparently, it turns out that he was upset that she constantly bitched about how old and how awful our house was. I told him that I was sorry about that and we would make sure that she respected the home. I asked my mum to come in and cleanse the house the next day. She was pretty pissed at me, but obliged anyway. I didn't tell her where we did the Ouija board, but she walked through the upstairs and froze at the bathroom door. She said that she would not go in there and that she felt a really strong energy coming from the mirror, which she couldn't see from the angle that she was at. She then walked through the rest and stopped at the stairwell, and she simply said, "You did it in the cellar, didn't you?" She did a cleansing ritual, and as soon as she banished this spirit, we all felt a really strong whoosh of just cold air above our heads. And after that, we all had issues and were fighting constantly. The other 2 girls moved out soon after, and after they left, I pretty much had no issues. The cellar door downstairs still pops open on its own from time to time, but I don't feel a negative energy anymore, that's for sure. I did eventually cleanse the board and took it out to the front yard. A couple of months later, too, I had a guest at our house that asked if he could have it. I told him that I was going to destroy it anyway, but he begged until I relented. And well, I guess it's his problem now, right? I do have some more stories from recent years if anyone's interested. My mum does ghost hunting now, so we've seen a lot of crazy stuff, but this was definitely one of the creepier ones.
I'm very lucky and live in a very, very close proximity to several really beautiful canyons, and I like to take my dog on hikes before work and such. So I took her and my mum's dog one day around 10 a.m. The canyon was pretty empty. It was a Wednesday or something, so it was just us on the trail that I like to hike. It's really long and winds along the face of a mountain. It's mostly a small dirt trail overlooking the main road, but there are a couple of areas that go back into the trees as well. There's a spot with a very large electrical box of some kind. I'm not sure if it's a generator or what, but it's in a gully surrounded by fencing. My mum's dog propped himself up on the small wooden barrier, probably to prevent avalanches or something, and looked intently at the box. I figured he saw a squirrel. Not directly behind us was a cluster of large trees, so it made sense. It seemed darker than the rest of the area, around 6 or so of them, I suppose, but I didn't think anything of it until my dog turned around and bristled, growling. Now, she's cranky as hell, so I knew her growl that meant, "Get away, I'm feeling like being rude to guests," and this was not it. This was different. It was just pure aggression. She was also just staring right at that spot. My mum's dog joined in, and they just started growling for about 15 seconds. When all of a sudden this massive, 10-foot long at least, black thing just whooshes out of the trees, and it just literally seemed to disappear into nothing. The trees were immediately back to normal, kind of strangely in a way, and after that I just decided to dip ASAP. To this day, I still have no idea what the hell that was. Maybe it's not paranormal, but it just seemed way too big to be a normal forest dweller. I'm really not sure what it was, but I got out of there quickly, that's for sure.